Hello, and welcome to Brada Tales. Tonight, we're bringing you a selection of eerie stories paired with the soothing sound of rain to help you relax and drift off to sleep. Before diving into the atmosphere of suspense, leave a comment below letting us know where you're watching from and what time it is. If these stories send chills down your spine, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe. Get comfortable, let the fear gradually envelop you, and tell us what kind of stories you'd like to hear next time. Settle in, we're about to begin. The crisis in the city. I never thought a small town in Texas could feel so isolated. The streets were empty more often than not. The sky always felt heavy with a dull, gray hue, even in the middle of summer. But when the first signs appeared, no one thought anything was amiss. At least, not at first. It started with a sound. You'd think it was just the wind at first, a faint rustle at the edge of your hearing. But after a while, it wasn't just the wind. It was something more deliberate. Something unnatural. It always came around midnight, when the rest of the town had settled into a strange stillness. I work at the local plant, the one that keeps the town alive, well, just barely. Business had slowed down, and there were whispers in the air about layoffs. People started looking over their shoulders more, not just because of the economic struggle, but because of something else. Something we couldn't explain. I'd catch glimpses of it, the movement in the shadows, at first, just a flicker, nothing too clear. Maybe it was just fatigue, or perhaps the stress of all the bad news in the air, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. The noises at night grew louder. It wasn't just rustling anymore, it was something solid, like footsteps, but wrong. They didn't sound human. The town was silent enough that you could hear them even through the thin walls of my small house. Slow, heavy thuds. A dragging sound, as if someone, was moving through the streets just outside my window. The same sound every night. I tried to ignore it. Told myself it was just the wind or maybe even an animal. But there was a particular sharpness to it, a rhythm that made me think twice. People in the town started whispering about it. Not just about the noise, but about what they were seeing or thought they were seeing. Some of them swore they saw shadows moving where there shouldn't have been any. Others, the more superstitious folk, started talking about the old legends. The ones about the land being cursed, about the darkness that had once settled here and never really left. And then there were the animals. I noticed it one morning when I stepped out onto my porch, rats, as big as dogs, running in the alley behind my house. But that wasn't the most unsettling part. They had eyes. Not like any eyes I'd seen before. They glowed just a little, but enough to make me shudder. At first, I brushed it off as just my imagination, but after that night, I couldn't stop thinking about it. I don't know what had happened exactly, but sometime between the whispers and the strange glowing eyes, the atmosphere of the town began to change. People weren't just acting nervous, they were acting afraid. I'd catch people looking over their shoulders, their eyes wide, their faces pale. They started avoiding the alleys, and the usual chatter in the diner was replaced with a heavy silence. Everyone had their eyes on the horizon, waiting for something, waiting for whatever it was that was coming to arrive. And that's when I saw it. It was late again. Later than usual. The clock struck midnight as I sat in my living room, trying to focus on anything other than the noise outside. It wasn't just a rustle anymore. The thuds were getting closer. I could hear the scraping sound, something dragging against the pavement. But this time, I didn't stay seated. I had to see what it was. I opened the front door and stepped into the cool night air. It was quiet. Too quiet. The usual sounds of crickets and rustling leaves were gone. Everything had stopped, like the world was holding its breath. And then, from the corner of my eye, I saw them. Figures, large, dark, moving in and out of the shadows. Their eyes. They glowed faintly, like the rats, but now there were more of them. And they were enormous. Bigger than any rat I had ever seen, bigger than any creature should be. I froze. My heart raced, and I felt the cold sweat trickle down my back. I didn't know what to think, didn't know what to do. But one thing was clear, they were real. And they were out there. I slammed the door shut, heart pounding in my chest. I locked it, checked the windows. The sounds didn't stop. They were still there, moving around the house, circling it, dragging their feet. I could hear their breath, slow, deliberate, as if they were waiting for something. I tried to convince myself it was just a bad dream, but then I heard a scream. It was distant, but unmistakable. A scream that seemed to come from the direction of the plant. That was it. This wasn't just strange. This wasn't just a trick of the mind. There was something terrible happening here. Something that had been hiding, waiting. And it was only a matter of time before it found us. I couldn't stay in my house, not with whatever that was lurking out there. The town was in trouble. But where could we go? Where could anyone go when the very earth beneath your feet was slowly being taken over by something far worse than any economic crisis? I grabbed my coat and rushed out, determined to find someone, anyone, who could make sense of this. But the streets were empty. The town, once so full of life, was silent. I don't know how long I wandered through the streets before I realized I wasn't going to find anyone. The town had turned into a ghost town. There were no lights in the windows, no voices calling out, no sound except for my own breathing and the faint, dragging footsteps that followed me. I could feel the tension in the air, thick and heavy, like a storm was about to break. The streetlights flickered, casting long shadows that seemed to stretch toward me, always just out of reach. The quiet was suffocating. The further I walked, the more I began to hear the noises again, those heavy, scraping sounds, now punctuated by something more, a low, guttural growl, as if something was getting closer, something large, something hungry. I kept my eyes straight ahead, not daring to look around. But even then, I could feel the weight of those glowing eyes on my back, tracking my every movement. I wanted to turn and run, but I couldn't. Something kept me moving forward, like a magnet pulling me into the unknown. Finally, I reached the outskirts of town. The old industrial plant loomed ahead, its massive metal structures casting long shadows in the pale moonlight. It was the last place I wanted to be, but it was where the screams had come from. I had to know if anyone was still there, if there was anyone who could explain this madness. The front gates were wide open, and the building stood in eerie silence. The sound of my footsteps echoed as I stepped inside, the air thick with the smell of oil and rust. I walked through the dark corridors, the overhead lights buzzing faintly, casting strange shapes on the walls. And then I heard it. A voice, faint but unmistakable, coming from the far end of the hall. "Help, please." It was weak, panicked, but it was human. I rushed toward the sound, my heart racing in my chest. The deeper I went into the plant, the darker it became. The walls were covered in grime, and there was a strange, almost metallic scent in the air. The only light came from the flickering overhead bulbs that did little to push back the heavy shadows. The sound of my own breathing was deafening as I pressed on. When I finally turned the corner, I saw him. It was one of the workers from the plant, his clothes torn, his face pale and sweaty. He was crouched on the ground, his hands clutching his knees, his eyes wide with terror. They're everywhere," he whispered, his voice cracking. "The rats, they're too big, they're coming for us." I crouched beside him, trying to calm him down, but his eyes were wild. It's okay," I said, my voice shaking. "We need to get out of here. We can't stay." He didn't respond. He just kept whispering, over and over, his words blending together in a broken chant. Too big, they're coming." And then I heard it. The sound of scratching against metal. I turned my head sharply, my eyes wide with panic, just in time to see the first of them emerge from the shadows. The rat, no, it couldn't be, was the size of a dog, its fur matted and dark, its eyes glowing with an unnatural light. It moved slowly, deliberately, its sharp claws scraping against the concrete floor as it crept closer. The worker beside me let out a scream, a high-pitched, frantic sound that echoed through the empty hall. The rat's eyes flickered toward him, then back to me. I could feel its gaze boring into me, as if it was deciding whether or not to attack. I grabbed the worker by the arm and yanked him to his feet, pulling him toward the exit. "We have to move, now!" I shouted. But he didn't respond. He was frozen, his gaze fixed on the rat that was now edging closer. I pulled harder, but he didn't budge. The rat took a step forward, and I could hear the sound of its teeth clicking together. I didn't wait any longer. I yanked the man with all my strength, dragging him down the hall, away from the rat, away from the growing shadows. But the sound of more scratching, more scurrying, echoed behind us. I dared not look back. I knew what was following us. We reached the front gates of the plant, and I nearly collapsed with relief when we were outside. But as I turned to check on the worker, I saw something that stopped me cold. He wasn't with me anymore. The worker was standing a few feet behind, his eyes wide and unfocused. The rats, dozens of them, maybe more, had appeared out of the darkness, surrounding him. I could see their glowing eyes reflecting the faint light, their claws clicking against the pavement. The worker's mouth opened in a scream, but it was cut short. The rats lunged, and I could hear the sickening crunch of bone. Then, silence. I stood there frozen, watching as the creatures tore him apart, their eyes glinting in the dark. My stomach turned, my heart pounding in my chest. I knew I had to run. I had to get out of there. But I couldn't move. Not yet. I stood in the doorway, staring at the destruction, my mind unable to process what was happening. The plants, once the lifeblood of this town, had become a tomb. And I was the only one left to witness the nightmare unfold. The rats weren't the only thing out there. There was something else, something worse. Something ancient that had been stirred by the economic collapse, by the darkness in our hearts. And it was coming for all of us. I don't know how long I stood there, paralyzed by what I had witnessed. The remains of the worker lay scattered on the ground, the rats feasting on him in the moonlight. I could feel my stomach turn, the bile rising in my throat, but I couldn't look away. The creatures were relentless, their claws tearing through flesh and bone with a sickening rhythm. It was a scene from a nightmare, but it was real, and I was standing there, unable to do anything. The silence after the chaos was almost worse than the violence. The rats scattered into the shadows, leaving nothing but the echo of their claws clicking on the pavement. The smell of blood and decay hung in the air, thick and suffocating. I could hear nothing except my own heartbeat pounding in my ears. I had to move. I had to get away. But every part of my body was screaming to run in the opposite direction, to flee this place and never look back. And yet, I stood there for another moment, frozen, my mind racing. What had I just seen? What were those creatures? And why were they here? How long had they been lurking in the darkness beneath the city? I couldn't answer those questions. Not yet. I turned and started running, my feet pounding against the pavement, my breath coming in sharp gasps. The town, once so familiar, felt alien now. Every corner I turned, every shadow I passed, seemed to shift with something watching, waiting. The streetlights flickered overhead, casting brief glimpses of the nightmare that surrounded me. The very air seemed heavier, charged with a malevolent presence, as though the town itself was becoming part of the terror. I had to get to the other side of town, to the old library. It was the only place I could think of where someone might still be. Maybe there was someone who knew what was happening, someone who could explain this. But as I ran, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being followed. The footsteps, the same slow, dragging pace I had heard before, were back. They were behind me, just out of sight, always keeping pace with me. I risked a glance over my shoulder, and there they were, two glowing eyes, watching me from the shadows. It was like the creatures had learned how to move in complete silence, how to stay hidden until it was too late. I tried to outrun them, but they were faster than I was. I could feel them closing in, the air thickening with their presence. The darkness seemed to stretch around me, swallowing the light and leaving only the feeling of something far worse than I could understand, lurking just out of view. When I reached the library, I slammed open the doors, the sound of the wood creaking under the force. The interior was just as I remembered, dusty, filled with rows upon rows of old books. But the place felt different now. It felt wrong. There was no warmth, no comfort. Just the heavy silence of a place that had been abandoned long ago. I moved quickly through the aisles, scanning the dimly lit room. The last few lights flickered and buzzed, threatening to go out. My footsteps echoed in the stillness, but there was no one around. No one to help. Then I heard it, a soft, whispering voice coming from the back of the library. I froze, my heart racing. It sounded like a woman, her voice low and rasping, as though she was speaking from the depths of the earth itself. I didn't want to go toward the voice. I didn't want to find out who or what was speaking, but I couldn't resist. Something inside me urged me to go. I turned the corner, and there she was. A woman, pale, gaunt, with dark circles under her eyes. She was sitting on the floor, surrounded by open books, her fingers tracing the pages like she was searching for something. Her face was twisted with a look of desperation, as if she were trapped in a world she couldn't escape. She didn't look up as I approached. She didn't acknowledge my presence at all. "Are you okay?" I asked, my voice trembling. "What's happening here? What's going on?" Her head jerked up suddenly, her eyes locking onto mine. There was something in her gaze, a wildness, a terror that made my blood run cold. "You shouldn't be here," she whispered, her voice hoarse. "They're watching. They're always watching. The rats, they're not the only thing. They're just the beginning. There's something beneath the city, something ancient, something that's waking up." I took a step back, my heart pounding in my chest. "What are you talking about? What's down there?" Her lips trembled as she spoke, but her words came out in a broken, fragmented whisper. The old rituals, the sacrifices, they disturbed the balance. They'd come back to finish what was started. I didn't understand. None of it made sense. But her eyes, those wild, pleading eyes, told me everything I needed to know. There was no time to waste. The town wasn't just under attack by these monstrous creatures. There was something far older, far darker, that had been unleashed. The woman's breath quickened, and I could hear the faint sound of scratching in the distance, growing louder. The rats were close. But so was something else. Something worse. Something that had been waiting in the shadows. I turned and ran, the sound of the woman's whispers chasing me as I fled back into the night. The streets were darker now, more oppressive, and the scratching sounds had grown into a steady, rhythmic beat. It was too late. Whatever had been disturbed beneath the city was coming for us, and I had no idea how to stop it. I ran through the streets, desperate, looking for an escape, but I knew deep down that there was nowhere to run. The town was already lost. The creatures were everywhere, and the darkness beneath the city was only growing stronger. I could hear them now, the rats. But they weren't alone. Something bigger was coming. Something that would make the rats look like nothing. And I was about to find out what it was. The streets of the town had turned into a labyrinth. Each corner I turned feeling more foreign than the last. The shadows seemed to stretch longer, the night darker, as if the town itself was being swallowed by something vast, something ancient. I could feel it, the ground vibrating beneath my feet, the air thick with a palpable dread. It was as if the very fabric of the town had been torn open, revealing the nightmare beneath. I didn't know where I was running anymore. My legs burned with exhaustion, but I couldn't stop. Not now. Not when the scratching sounds were growing louder and the faint whispers of the woman echoed in my mind. The rats were no longer the only threat. I could feel something else, something deeper, something that had been waiting for centuries, stirring beneath the earth, ready to consume us all. I turned another corner, my breath ragged, and found myself facing the old church. It had always been a place of solace for the people of the town, tall, imposing, with stained glass windows that seemed to shimmer even in the dark. But now, it looked different. The air around it felt wrong, charged with an unnatural energy. The doors were open, just slightly, as if inviting me in. I hesitated. Something told me I should turn away, but my legs carried me toward it anyway. As I crossed the threshold, the temperature dropped and a chill ran through my spine. The church, once filled with the scent of incense and candles, now reeked of dampness and decay. The pews were overturned, and the altar, once pristine, was now marred with dark stains, the remnants of something long past. The scratching sounds were louder here, echoing off the stone walls. But there was something else now, low, guttural growls, as if something was stirring deep beneath the church, waking from a long, cursed sleep. The air felt thick with malice, and I could almost hear it, whispers, like the voices of the damned, rising from the very ground beneath me. I stepped forward, each footstep sounding too loud in the oppressive silence. My heart hammered in my chest, but my body moved on its own accord, driven by some unseen force. I walked toward the altar, the heavy air pressing against me, and that's when I saw it. A crack in the floor, just in front of the altar. It wasn't there before. It looked new, as though the earth itself had split open, revealing a dark, yawning abyss below. The crack pulsed with an unnatural light, flickering like a dying flame, and from it came a sound that made my blood run cold, a low, droning hum, like the sound of something stirring, something ancient. I knelt down, my fingers trembling as I touched the crack. The moment I did, a surge of energy shot through me, a jolt of pure terror that seemed to tear through my chest. It was like being connected to something far greater than anything I could comprehend, something hungry, something old. And then I heard it. A voice. It wasn't a whisper this time. It was louder, clearer, more real. It was a low, guttural growl, but it formed words. You should not have come. The hunger is here. And now you will feed. I recoiled, stumbling back as the crack in the floor began to widen, the ground trembling beneath me. From the depths below, I saw them. The rats. But they weren't just rats anymore. They had grown, mutated, their bodies twisting into monstrous, grotesque forms. Their eyes glowed with a malevolent light, their teeth razor sharp, glistening in the dim light. They crawled up from the crack, their claws clicking on the stone, their bodies writhing in a sickening dance of hunger. I scrambled to my feet, my heart racing as I turned to run. But the doors of the church slammed shut, sealing me inside. The rats were everywhere now, pouring from the crack like a flood, their numbers endless. I could hear them skittering across the floor, their eyes following my every move. They circled around me, slowly, methodically, as if they were toying with me. I backed away, my breath shallow, but the more I moved, the more they came. The ground beneath me shifted, and I realized with horror that the floor was cracking, breaking open like the earth itself was hungry. And then I heard the growl again, louder this time, from deep below the church. It was no longer just the rats. It was something else, something far worse, something more powerful than I could ever imagine. I could feel it, could sense its presence, as if it was reaching up through the ground, ready to pull me down with it. I couldn't breathe. The air was thick with the smell of decay, and I could feel the darkness closing in around me. My heart was pounding in my ears, drowning out everything else. And then I saw it. A figure, tall and shadowy, rising from the crack in the earth. It was no longer just a creature of rats. It was something more, something ancient, something that had been waiting for centuries, for the right moment to emerge. Its form was twisted and shifting, its body like a dark mass of writhing shadows, with glowing red eyes that pierced through the darkness, locking onto mine. You have awakened us, the voice hissed again, its tone dripping with malice. Now you will witness the end. I stumbled back, my legs shaking, my mind screaming for escape, but there was nowhere to go. The church, the town, everything was crumbling, consumed by the darkness below. The rats, the creature, they were all part of it. They were the harbingers of something far older, far more terrifying than I had ever imagined. The floor beneath me cracked open fully, and the shadows reached out, pulling me toward the abyss. I screamed, but my voice was swallowed by the growl of the creature and the relentless scratching of the rats as they surged forward, covering everything, consuming everything. And in that final moment, as the darkness closed in around me, I realized with sickening clarity there was no escape. The town was lost. I was lost. And the darkness, the hunger, would never stop. I can't remember how long I fought, how long I struggled against the darkness that consumed everything around me. It was as if time itself had stopped, the seconds stretching into hours, into eternity. The weight of the shadows bore down on me, suffocating me, pulling me deeper into the abyss. I was surrounded by the rats now, swarming, crawling over every inch of me, their claws scratching at my skin, their eyes glowing with hunger. I could hear them, feel them, but I could do nothing. The monstrous form that had risen from the crack towered over me, its eyes burning into my soul, its presence suffocating. The growl it emitted was deafening, reverberating through every bone in my body, shaking the very core of my being. It was no longer just a creature. It was an embodiment of the darkness beneath the earth, a force that had been waiting for this moment for centuries, a force that was beyond comprehension. "You will become part of us," it hissed, its voice like 1,000 voices speaking in unison, each one more chilling than the last. "The town is already ours. The hunger has been awakened. You are nothing." I couldn't fight it anymore. My strength was gone, my will was fading, and the terror that gripped my heart was overwhelming. But then, through the endless shadows and the growls, something strange happened. I felt a pulse, faint, weak, but there. Something inside me stirred, a flicker of resistance, a whisper of defiance. I don't know what it was, but in that moment, I knew I couldn't just give in. I couldn't let the darkness win. With every ounce of strength I had left, I forced myself to move. My body screamed in pain, my limbs numb and heavy, but I crawled away from the encroaching swarm, away from the presence that loomed above me. The rats were still all around, but I didn't stop. I didn't look back. There was no time. I reached the altar, the place where it had all begun. The crack in the floor was wider now, the glowing light pulsing faster, like a heartbeat, an evil, relentless heartbeat. I could feel the ground beneath me trembling, as though the world was about to split open completely. I could hear it, the whispers, the growls, the scratching. It was all around me, overwhelming me, trying to drag me into the darkness. But something deep inside told me that I could still stop it. There had to be a way. With trembling hands, I reached into my pocket, my fingers brushing against something cold. The old key, the one I had found earlier. It felt insignificant, a relic of the past, but something about it, something about this moment, told me that it was the key to ending all of this. I didn't know how. I didn't understand it. But I had to try. I knelt in front of the crack, the rats swarming just behind me, their teeth snapping at my heels. With a final burst of energy, I jammed the key into the crack, pushing it into the earth as if I were locking something away. As soon as the key made contact, a flash of light erupted from the ground, blinding me, and the air around me seemed to crackle with energy. The growls, the whispers, the scratching, all of it stopped, as if the world itself had held its breath. The ground trembled once more, but this time it was different. The earth began to seal itself, the cracks slowly closing, the glowing light fading away. The rats scattered, retreating back into the darkness from which they had come. The oppressive weight of the creature's presence lifted, and for the first time in what felt like forever, I could breathe. I fell to my knees, gasping for air, my body trembling with exhaustion. The church, the town, it was all still here, but it felt different. The darkness that had suffocated everything was gone, and a strange stillness had settled over the place. It was as if the nightmare had never happened, as if the town was finally free. But I knew better. I knew that the darkness was not truly gone. It had been sealed away, hidden beneath the earth once more. But the hunger, the evil, it was still there. Waiting. Watching. I could hear the faint echo of the rats' claws in the distance, their whispers carried by the wind. They were still out there. And the creature, the ancient force that had awoken from the depths, was not gone forever. It was only sleeping. I looked around the church, my heart still racing. The altar, the stained glass windows, the floor, everything seemed unchanged, yet the air was different. The nightmare had left its mark. The fear, the uncertainty, it lingered like a shadow, never fully leaving. I stumbled to my feet, my legs weak, my mind struggling to make sense of what had just happened. Was I safe? Was the town safe? No. The answer came to me with chilling clarity. The darkness had been sealed, yes, but it had only been held back. The hunger, the ancient evil, was patient. It would wait. And when the time came again, it would rise. And when it did, I wouldn't be here to stop it. I took one last look at the church, at the town, and then I turned and walked away. I didn't know where I was going, but I knew one thing for certain: there was no escaping the truth. The darkness was always there, lurking beneath the surface. And one day, it would return. And when it did, the town would fall again. And this time, there would be no escape. Whisper in the night. Have you ever heard a sound that shouldn't exist, something so out of place that it shakes the very foundation of your sanity? I hadn't until I moved into that house. It was an old wooden structure nestled deep in the mountains of North Carolina. From the outside, it looked like a postcard come to life, a porch with creaking swings, ivy climbing up the walls, and a thick forest that seemed to whisper secrets when the wind passed through. I had come here to escape the noise of the city, to find peace and solitude. But solitude, as I would soon learn, can quickly turn to isolation. The first night was uneventful, almost serene. The wind hummed softly against the windows, and the forest seemed alive in a comforting way. I fell asleep to the sound of crickets, their rhythmic chirping a soothing balm to my weary mind. It wasn't until the second night that I heard it. At first, it was subtle, a faint rustling from the woods just beyond the edge of the porch. I dismissed it as an animal, perhaps a deer or a raccoon. But as the hours crept by, the sound grew louder, more deliberate. It wasn't the random noise of a creature scurrying through leaves, it was something purposeful. Footsteps. I told myself it was nothing. The mind plays tricks in the dark, doesn't it? I locked the door, double-checked the windows, and buried myself under the covers. Sleep came reluctantly, haunted by the echo of those steps. The following morning, I decided to investigate. The forest loomed large and endless, its towering trees blotting out the sunlight in places. I walked cautiously, scanning the ground for signs of movement. That's when I saw them, tracks. They were unlike anything I'd seen before, a bizarre blend of human and animal. The prints were elongated, with sharp claw-like indentations at the tips. I crouched down, examining them closer. They were fresh. Whatever had left them had been here recently, very recently. Probably a bear, I muttered, though the words felt hollow. Deep down, I knew that wasn't true. These prints didn't belong to any bear or mountain lion. They belonged to something else. That night, the sounds returned. This time, they were closer. The footsteps circled the house, slow and deliberate, like a predator toying with its prey. My heart pounded in my chest as I stood frozen by the window, straining to see through the darkness. The porch light flickered, casting eerie shadows across the yard. And then I saw it, just for a moment. Two glowing eyes stared back at me from the tree line. They were too high off the ground to belong to any ordinary animal, and their brightness was unnatural, almost otherworldly. I gasped, stumbling backward. When I looked again, the eyes were gone. I spent the rest of the night wide awake, every creak and groan of the house sending my nerves into overdrive. By dawn, I was exhausted but determined. I needed answers. I called the nearest ranger station, describing the tracks and the eyes. The man on the other end of the line laughed, his tone dismissive. "Sounds like you've got yourself a case of mountain paranoia," he said. "Happens to folks not used to the woods." "But the tracks." "Probably a bear," he interrupted. "Or nothing at all. The woods can play tricks on you, especially at night." I hung up, frustration gnawing at me. Mountain paranoia? Was I imagining things? The tracks were real. The eyes were real. Weren't they? That evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, I armed myself with a flashlight and a sense of defiance. If whatever was out there wanted to scare me, it had succeeded. But I wasn't going to run. Not yet. The flashlight's beam cut through the darkness as I stepped onto the porch, the cold night air biting at my skin. The forest was silent, unnervingly so. Even the crickets had gone quiet. "Who's there?" I called out, my voice trembling despite my best efforts. The words echoed back at me, swallowed by the trees. And then, from the depths of the woods, a sound emerged, a low, guttural growl, deep and resonant. It wasn't the sound of an animal. It was something far more menacing. The growl grew louder, closer, vibrating through the ground beneath me. My flashlight flickered, and for a brief moment, the beam landed on a figure, tall, hunched, and grotesque, with elongated limbs and glowing eyes that pierced the darkness. I stumbled backward, slamming the door shut and bolting it. My heart raced as the growling continued, now accompanied by the sound of scratching at the walls, the windows. It was everywhere, surrounding the house, closing in. I grabbed a knife from the kitchen, gripping it tightly as I backed into a corner. The sounds grew louder, more frantic, and then silence. The stillness was deafening, more terrifying than the noise had been. I waited, every muscle in my body tense, my eyes fixed on the door. And then, softly, from just outside the window, came a whisper. "Come out." It was a voice that shouldn't exist. The whisper echoed in my mind long after it had stopped. It wasn't loud, but it was clear, too clear. I sat frozen in the corner of the kitchen, clutching the knife so tightly my knuckles turned white. The silence that followed was suffocating. My ears strained to catch even the faintest sound, but all I heard was the relentless pounding of my own heart. I don't know how long I stayed like that. Minutes? Hours? Time lost all meaning in the stillness of the night. When the first rays of dawn crept through the windows, I finally allowed myself to move. I crept to the window, careful to stay hidden behind the curtain, and peeked out. The yard was empty, save for the footprints. They were everywhere, circling the house, leading from the porch to the tree line and back again. Some were small, others impossibly large, as if they belonged to multiple creatures. My stomach churned at the sight. I spent the morning barricading the house. Every window, every door, every possible entrance, I sealed them all. It wasn't perfect, but it gave me a shred of comfort. If they wanted to get in, they'd have to work for it. By afternoon, the fear had begun to dull, replaced by a simmering anger. I refused to be a prisoner in my own home. Whatever was out there, it was trying to scare me, to drive me out. But I wasn't leaving, not without answers. Armed with a flashlight, a camera, and the knife from the kitchen, I ventured into the woods. The forest was eerily quiet, the usual chorus of birds and insects replaced by an oppressive stillness. Every step felt like a violation, as if I were trespassing in a place I didn't belong. I followed the tracks, keeping my flashlight trained on the ground. They led me deeper into the woods, winding between trees that seemed to close in around me. The air grew colder, and the sunlight barely penetrated the dense canopy above. After what felt like an eternity, I came to a clearing. At the center stood a circle of stones, blackened as if by fire. The ground was littered with bones, small ones, scattered haphazardly like the remains of a feast. A shiver ran down my spine as I realized some of them looked human. I raised the camera, snapping photos with trembling hands. The sound of the shutter felt deafening in the stillness. And then I heard it. A whisper, soft and insidious, coming from the trees behind me. "Why have you come?" I spun around, my flashlight slicing through the darkness, but there was no one there. "Who's there?" I shouted, my voice cracking. The whisper came again, closer this time. "You shouldn't be here." The voice was low and rasping, with an edge that made my skin crawl. It wasn't just one voice, it was many, overlapping and weaving together like the strands of a web. I turned to run, but my feet wouldn't move. The air felt thick, like invisible hands were holding me in place. Panic surged through me as shadows began to emerge from the trees, their forms indistinct but undeniably human, or something close to it. The creatures stepped into the clearing, their eyes glowing with the same unnatural light I'd seen before. Their limbs were too long, their movements jerky and unnatural, as if they were puppets controlled by unseen strings. One of them raised a clawed hand, pointing directly at me. "Leave," it hissed, the word reverberating through the air like a command. Finally, my legs obeyed. I turned and ran, not caring where I was going, just desperate to put as much distance as possible between me and those things. The forest seemed alive, branches clawing at my clothes, roots rising to trip me. The whispers followed me, growing louder, more insistent. "You can't escape." I burst out of the woods, my lungs burning, and collapsed onto the porch of the house. My hands shook as I fumbled with the door, finally managing to shut it open and slam it shut behind me. The whispers stopped. For the first time in what felt like hours, there was silence. But it wasn't comforting. It was the kind of silence that waits, that watches. I backed away from the door, my breath ragged, and noticed something on the floor. A single, blackened stone sat in the center of the room, identical to the ones in the clearing. And etched into the wood beneath it was a single word, "Stay." The stone felt heavier than it should have, its surface rough and unnaturally warm. I couldn't bring myself to touch it. It sat in the center of the room like a beacon, radiating an oppressive presence. I shoved it across the floor with my foot, and it rolled to a stop against the wall. The word "stay" etched beneath it glared up at me, daring me to defy its command. I spent the rest of the day inside, pacing the house, jumping at every creak and groan. The forest outside was alive with shadows that didn't belong. I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched, even with every window covered. By nightfall, I was exhausted but too afraid to sleep. Instead, I sat in the living room, knife in one hand, flashlight in the other, my back pressed against the wall. The hours dragged on, and the silence grew heavier. Then, just after midnight, the sounds began. At first, it was faint, like leaves rustling in the wind. But there was no wind. The air was still, suffocating. The sound grew louder, closer, until it became unmistakable. Footsteps. Slow, deliberate, circling the house. I held my breath, straining to hear. The footsteps stopped, replaced by a soft tapping at the front door. Tap. 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 It was rhythmic, methodical, as if whoever, or whatever, was on the other side, wanted to lull me into a false sense of security. "Go away!" I shouted, my voice cracking in the oppressive silence. The tapping stopped. For a moment, there was nothing. Then came the whisper, soft and mocking. "You were told to stay." The voice sent a shiver down my spine. It sounded like it was right next to me, but I was alone in the room. I gripped the knife tighter, my knuckles white, and backed toward the kitchen. My pulse thundered in my ears as I moved, step by cautious step, keeping my eyes on the front door. That's when I heard the sound that made my blood run cold. A creak from upstairs. I froze, every muscle in my body locking up. The knife felt useless in my hand, like a child's toy against whatever was up there. Creak. It was deliberate, one step at a time, as if the intruder wanted me to know exactly where they were. I pointed the flashlight toward the staircase, its beam cutting through the darkness. The light trembled as my hand shook, illuminating the bottom step, but nothing beyond. "Who's there?" I called out, my voice barely more than a whisper. No response. Just another creak, closer this time. Panic took over. I bolted into the kitchen, slamming the door shut behind me. My hand scrambled to lock it, but the lock was old, and my fingers fumbled uselessly against the mechanism. Then I heard it. Breathing. Slow and steady, just beyond the door. I pressed my ear against the wood, trying to convince myself I was imagining it, but the sound was undeniable. It wasn't human. It was too wet, too guttural, like something breathing through water. The door shuddered. Not from a knock or a push, it was vibrating, as if something was pressing against it, testing its strength. Desperate, I looked around the kitchen for anything else I could use as a weapon. My eyes landed on the stove. Without thinking, I grabbed a pan from the counter and lit one of the burners, holding the pan over the flame until it glowed red. The door shuddered again, harder this time, the wood groaning under the pressure. I raised the pan, ready to swing it at whatever came through. But then the sound stopped. The door went still. The breathing ceased. For a moment, I thought it was over. I lowered the pan, my breath coming in shallow gasps. And then the whisper came again, this time from right behind me. "You can't hide." I spun around, swinging the pan wildly, but there was nothing there. Nothing except the stone. It was sitting on the kitchen counter, though I'd left it in the living room. The air around it shimmered, distorted, as if it were radiating heat. I backed away, my heart pounding. The whispers grew louder, surrounding me, overlapping until they became a deafening cacophony. "Stay, stay, stay." I covered my ears, but it didn't help. The voices were inside my head, crawling through my mind like worms. The lights flickered, and the room plunged into darkness. And then, in the pitch black, I felt it, a hand on my shoulder. It was cold, clammy, and impossibly strong. It yanked me backward, and I screamed, thrashing against its grip. The last thing I saw before I hit the floor was the stone, glowing faintly in the dark, its surface now etched with another word. "Run." I woke up on the cold kitchen floor, my breath coming in short, panicked gasps. The stone was gone. The whispers had stopped, replaced by an oppressive silence that pressed down on me like a weight. For a moment, I thought I might have imagined everything. But then I saw the scratches. Deep gouges ran across the wooden floorboards, leading from where I had fallen to the front door. The marks were jagged, as though claws had raked through the wood. My arms ached, and when I looked down, I saw faint bruises forming where the hand had grabbed me. This was real. I needed to leave. My hands trembled as I packed a small bag with essentials, flashlight, food, water. The thought of staying even a moment longer in this cursed house was unbearable. My truck was parked just outside. If I could make it to the vehicle, I could drive down the mountain and never look back. But as I stepped into the hallway, I froze. The front door was wide open. The cool night air swept in, carrying with it a faint, sickly sweet odor. Something about the smell made my stomach turn. Beyond the door, the forest loomed, its trees casting long, distorted shadows under the moonlight. I didn't remember opening the door. Clutching the flashlight, I crept forward, peering outside. The ground was littered with more scratches, as if something had been dragging itself across the dirt. And there, just beyond the porch, was the stone. It sat in the center of the path, its surface gleaming faintly in the moonlight. New words were carved into it. Too late. A chill ran down my spine. My instinct screamed at me to run, to get as far away as possible, but my legs refused to move. Then I heard it. A low, guttural growl coming from the trees. The flashlight beam trembled as I pointed it toward the sound. At first, I saw nothing but the dense underbrush, the shadows shifting unnaturally. But then the beam caught a pair of eyes, reflective, yellow, and too high off the ground to belong to any animal I knew. The growl deepened, vibrating through the air, and the thing began to move. It was fast, too fast. The flashlight barely kept up as the figure darted between the trees, its movements jerky and unnatural. I caught glimpses of limbs that were too long, a hunched, misshapen body, and claws that gleamed like polished steel. My survival instincts kicked in. I turned and bolted for the truck, my heart pounding so hard it felt like it might burst. The forest came alive with movement behind me, branches snapping, leaves rustling, the creature's growl growing louder and closer. I reached the truck and fumbled for the keys in my pocket, my fingers slipping as panic set in. The growling was right behind me now, accompanied by the sound of claws scraping against the dirt. The engine roared to life, and I slammed the truck into gear, flooring the gas pedal. The tires spun for a moment before catching, and the vehicle lurched forward, throwing me back against the seat. In the rearview mirror, I saw it. The creature was enormous, its body a grotesque amalgamation of limbs and shadows, its eyes glowing like embers. It sprinted after the truck, closing the distance with horrifying speed. I soared wildly down the narrow mountain road, the tires skidding on loose gravel. The forest blurred past in a dark haze, the creature's growls echoing in my ears. Then, without warning, it leapt. A massive weight slammed onto the back of the truck, and the rear window shattered. Shards of glass rained down on me as I fought to keep control of the wheel. A clawed hand reached through the broken window, swiping inches from my face. I screamed, twisting the wheel violently to the side. The truck veered off the road, crashing through the underbrush before slamming into a tree. The impact knocked the wind out of me. Dazed, I scrambled to unbuckle my seatbelt, my ears ringing. The growls were deafening now, and I could feel the creature's presence just outside the cab. I grabbed the flashlight and swung it wildly, the beam catching the creature's face for the first time. It was worse than I could have imagined. Its features were a grotesque mockery of humanity, its mouth filled with rows of jagged teeth that glistened with saliva. Its skin was stretched, tight over its skeletal frame, and its eyes burned with an intelligence that was far more terrifying than its monstrous appearance. It lunged at me, and I threw open the door, tumbling out onto the ground. Pain shot through my leg, but I didn't stop. I crawled away as fast as I could, the flashlight bouncing wildly in my grip. Behind me, the creature tore into the truck, its claws ripping through metal as if it were paper. Sparks flew, and the sound of shredding steel filled the air. I didn't look back. I couldn't. My only thought was to run, to survive. The forest seemed endless, the trees closing in around me. The ground was uneven, and I stumbled repeatedly, my injured legs slowing me down. The growls faded into the distance, but I knew better than to think I was safe. The stone's final message echoed in my mind. Too late. The forest consumed me. The flashlight's beam grew weaker with every step, the battery straining against the suffocating darkness. My breath came in shallow gasps, each one ragged with panic. I couldn't stop, couldn't think, couldn't let the creature catch me. The growling had faded, replaced by an eerie quiet that was somehow worse. Every snap of a twig, every rustle of leaves made me jump, my eyes darting to the shadows. My leg throbbed, blood seeping from a gash I hadn't even noticed during the chaos. I stumbled into a clearing, the moonlight illuminating a small, weathered cabin. Its windows were dark, the door slightly ajar. It wasn't safety, but it was shelter. I had no other choice. I limped toward the cabin, every step sending waves of pain through my body. The silence pressed against my ears, broken only by the faint crunch of my boots on the dry leaves. Inside, the air was stale, heavy with the scent of rot and mildew. The floorboards creaked under my weight as I pushed the door shut behind me. A wooden bar lay nearby, and I slid it into place, securing the door as best I could. The cabin was barren, its walls lined with cobwebs and peeling paint. A single table stood in the center, its surface covered in strange carvings. They were similar to the ones on the stone, symbols that seemed to shift and writhe when I looked at them for too long. A chill ran through me. I sank into a corner, clutching the flashlight like a lifeline. My mind raced, replaying the events of the night. The stone. The whispers. The creature. None of it made sense, yet it was all horrifyingly real. A soft knock broke the silence. It came from the door. My heart stopped. The knock came again, louder this time. It wasn't frantic or aggressive, just a steady, deliberate tap. I held my breath, every muscle in my body tensed. The creature couldn't knock, it didn't need to. This was something else. Please, a voice called from the other side. It was faint, trembling, human. Let me in. I'm hurt. No. I pressed myself harder against the wall, my mind screaming at me not to move. This was wrong. It had to be. The voice grew more desperate. Help me. Please, it's out here. My hand moved to the flashlight switch, turning it off. Darkness enveloped me, but I hoped it would make me invisible, unnoticeable. The knocking stopped. Silence. And then, a whisper, just inches from my ear. You can't hide. I spun around, the flashlight flicking back on, its beam cutting through the black. The cabin was empty. But the door was open. The bar lay splintered on the floor, and beyond the threshold, the forest stood still and silent. My heart pounded in my chest as I backed away, the flashlight trembling in my grip. Then I saw it. The creature stood in the doorway, its hunched form filling the frame. Its eyes glowed with that same terrible intelligence, and its mouth twisted into something resembling a grin. You ran, it said, its voice a guttural growl that echoed in my mind. But there's nowhere to go. I screamed, hurling the flashlight at it. The beam spun wildly, casting grotesque shadows across the walls. But the creature didn't flinch. It lunged. The impact knocked the breath out of me, its claws pinning me to the floor. Pain seared through my body as its weight crushed me, its rancid breath filling my nostrils. Too late, it whispered, its voice dripping with malice. And then everything went dark. When I woke up, the forest was quiet. The cabin was gone, replaced by an endless expanse of trees. My body felt heavy, unresponsive, as if it no longer belonged to me. I tried to move, but my limbs refused. My mouth opened to scream, but no sound came out. And then I saw it, the stone. It lay a few feet away, its surface smooth and untouched, save for a single new carving. Welcome. As the sun rose, its light revealed what I had become, a shadow among the trees, my reflection shimmering faintly in the stone's surface. I wasn't alone. The whispers started again, faint at first, then growing louder. I was the forest now, a part of its endless, hungry silence. And somewhere in the distance, I heard the sound of footsteps. Another traveler. Another life for the taking. The forest always wins. Bones in the ground. Have you ever wondered what lies beneath the earth you walk on? When the construction crews began digging up the empty lot in Oklahoma and suburbia, nobody expected to find anything other than dirt and rocks. The area had been slated for a new development of homes, a neighborhood filled with cookie-cutter houses, white picket fences, and tidy lawns. It was meant to be a place where families would thrive. But on the third day of excavation, they found the first bones. I remember the call coming into the city office. My name is Henry Adams, and I'm the town's land surveyor. When the foreman mentioned remains, I assumed it was an old animal carcass, maybe a cow or deer. In rural Oklahoma, that wasn't unusual. But when I arrived at the site, I knew it wasn't animal bones they found. The bones were long, slender, unmistakably human. They were weathered, yellowed by time, and had been unearthed in a patch of loose, sandy soil. More troubling, they weren't alone. 2 workers were still standing by the shallow pit when I approached, their faces pale and drawn. We stopped digging as soon as we saw them, one of them muttered, pointing to the spot. The unearthed skeleton lay curled in a fetal position. I could see fragments of what looked like decayed fabric clinging to its rib cage, and nearby, a rusted metal cross half buried in the dirt. Call the county coroner, I instructed, trying to sound calm. And stop all digging until we know what this is. The foreman nodded, already reaching for his phone, but I could feel the unease settling over the crew. It wasn't every day you dug up a grave. The coroner arrived quickly, her expression grim as she examined the remains. This isn't recent, she said, brushing dirt from the skull's temple. Judging by the condition, I estimate these bones are at least 80 to 100 years old. A forgotten grave? I suggested. Possibly, she replied, though her furrowed brow suggested doubt. But it's strange. This land doesn't appear on any historical records as a cemetery. Over the next few days, the digging continued under careful supervision, but what we found only deepened the mystery. By the end of the week, a total of 15 skeletons had been unearthed. They were scattered across the site, some buried shallowly, others deeper, all in various states of decay. No coffins. No headstones. Just bones. The local newspaper ran a story, forgotten graveyard found in proposed development. But that wasn't entirely accurate. It wasn't a graveyard, it was something else. What haunted me most were the marks. Almost every skull we uncovered bore deep scratches and fractures, as if from violent blows. The femurs had strange indentations, and one pelvis even had what appeared to be bite marks, far too large for any human jaw. What could have done this? I asked the coroner one evening. She shook her head, her eyes dark with concern. It doesn't match any known tools or weapons, she admitted. And those bite marks? I don't know. It doesn't make sense. But sense was slipping further away with each new discovery. One night, after everyone had gone home, I stayed behind at the site, pacing the edges of the dig. The air was heavy, the kind of stillness that felt wrong for an open field. My flashlight swept over the pits, casting long, eerie shadows across the exposed bones. That's when I heard it. A faint whisper, carried on the breeze. At first, I thought it was my imagination, but then it came again, low, guttural, and almost unintelligible. Help! I froze, the beam of my flashlight trembling. Who's there? I called out, my voice louder than intended. The whispering stopped. I took a hesitant step toward the sound, my boots crunching on the loose gravel. The hair on the back of my neck stood on end, every instinct screaming at me to leave. But I had to know. I crouched near the edge of one of the pits, shining my light downward. The beam illuminated the skeletal remains of what looked like a child, its skull tilted unnaturally to the side. For a moment, nothing happened. Then the ground moved. It was subtle at first, like a ripple across water. But as I stared, I saw the soil around the bones shift and writhe, as if something beneath was trying to claw its way up. A scream caught in my throat as the whisper returned, louder now, layered with voices. Help us. I stumbled back, the flashlight dropping from my hand. It hit the ground with a dull thud, plunging the area into darkness. Behind me, I heard the unmistakable sound of footsteps, slow, deliberate, and getting closer. I ran. The whispers followed. The next morning, I returned to the site under the guise of professionalism, though my insides churned with unease. The whispers, the moving earth, I had convinced myself it was a trick of the wind, my imagination running wild in the isolation of night. But as the crew gathered around the latest discovery, I realized the dread wasn't mine alone. You feel it, don't you? One of the workers muttered. His name was Pete, a grizzled man with decades of construction experience. This place ain't right. I didn't reply, but the silence between us said enough. The courier arrived shortly after with her assistant, unloading their equipment. Today, we were examining a skeleton that had been found deeper than the others. This one was lying face down, its arms outstretched as if reaching for something or fleeing. As we stood over it, the coroner frowned. The marks are worse on this one, she said, pointing to the spine. It was splintered in several places, the breaks jagged and unnatural. Almost as if something crushed it. What could have caused that? I asked, but I wasn't sure I wanted the answer. Nothing I can identify, she replied, her voice tight. The unease grew heavier as the day wore on. By mid-afternoon, half the crew had left, muttering excuses about needing air or feeling sick. Pete stayed, but his nerves were wearing thin. I decided to take a walk around the perimeter of the site, hoping to clear my head. The field stretched out in all directions, dotted with half-finished foundations and scattered equipment. It should have been a picture of progress, but instead, it felt abandoned, forgotten. As I approached the tree lane at the edge of the lot, I noticed something odd. A narrow trail, barely visible, winding into the woods. It wasn't on any of the site maps. Curiosity, or foolishness, got the better of me. I followed the path, pushing aside branches and overgrown weeds. The air grew cooler as I walked, the sunlight dimming under the thick canopy. After about 15 minutes, I reached a clearing. In the center stood a crumbling stone structure, half buried in moss and vines. It looked like the remnants of a small chapel, its walls cracked and leaning, the roof long gone. Etched into the stone above the doorway was a symbol, a circle with jagged lines radiating outward. It wasn't any religious iconography I recognized, but it sent a chill down my spine. I stepped inside. The interior was sparse, little more than a shell of what it once was. The floor was dirt, scattered with broken stone and debris. But in the center, something caught my eye, a shallow pit, surrounded by dark stains that looked too much like dried blood. And then I heard it again. The whispers. This time, they weren't faint or distant. They were close, circling me, overlapping voices that spoke in no language I could understand. My breath quickened, my pulse pounding in my ears. I backed toward the entrance, my eyes darting around the room. Shadows flickered along the walls, though there was no source of light. A voice rose above the others, clear and sharp. "Do not disturb the ground." I turned and ran, crashing through the underbrush until I reached the edge of the construction site. My chest heaved as I leaned against a tree, trying to steady myself. "Henry!" Pete's voice snapped me back to reality. He was running toward me, his face pale. "What's wrong?" I asked, though I already knew the answer. "It's the dig," he said, his voice shaking. "There's more. Bones everywhere." And he trailed off, glancing over his shoulder as if something might be following him. The ground, it moved. Like it was alive. I didn't need convincing. "Get everyone out of there," I ordered, already heading back. When we reached the site, chaos had erupted. Workers were shouting, tools abandoned as they scrambled to leave. In the center of the excavation, the earth was shifting, collapsing in on itself to reveal a gaping hole. It wasn't natural. The pit was too perfect, its edges smooth, the soil spiraling downward as if into an endless void. And from within came the sounds, scraping, shuffling, and that terrible whispering. Pete grabbed my arm. "We have to go. Now." I stared into the pit, my mind racing. I wanted to leave, to run as far from this cursed place as possible. But something held me there, a terrible fascination. As I leaned closer, I saw movement in the darkness below. Not shadows, but forms, twisted, skeletal figures clawing their way upward. Their empty eye sockets seemed to lock onto mine, and I stumbled back with a gasp. "Henry!" Pete shouted, pulling me away just as a hand, no, a claw, emerged from the pit, its bony fingers curling around the edge. We ran, the whispers chasing us into the fading light. That night, I couldn't sleep. Even with the windows bolted shut and every light in my house blazing, the darkness seemed alive. Every creak of the floorboards, every rustle of the wind outside, set my heart racing. I couldn't shake the image of that claw. It wasn't just a skeleton, it was something far worse. Pete called me around midnight. "I'm at the bar," he said, his voice shaky. "You should come." I didn't want to go. I wanted to lock myself in and pretend none of it was real. But the thought of being alone was worse. The bar was nearly empty when I arrived. Pete sat at the far corner, nursing a whiskey. He looked worse than I felt. His hands trembled, and his face was pale. "They're shutting the site down," he said as I slid onto the stool beside him. I nodded. "Good. But it's not over, Henry," he continued, lowering his voice. "I went back after you left. Just for a second. I had to see it again." "You what?" "There's more than just bones down there," he said, his eyes darting to the dark corners of the bar. "I saw things moving, crawling out of the ground. And the whispers, they're not just in my head. I recorded them." He pulled out his phone and pressed play. At first, it was static. Then came the faint murmurs, growing louder, overlapping until they became a cacophony. Words in an unrecognizable language, spoken with an urgency that made my skin crawl. "Turn it off," I hissed, glancing around. Pete complied, stuffing the phone back into his pocket. "What the hell do we do?" he asked, his voice breaking. "I don't know," I admitted. We sat in silence, the weight of the unknown pressing down on us. By the time I got home, it was nearly dawn. The first rays of sunlight peeked over the horizon, offering a fragile sense of safety. I decided to return to the site. I couldn't explain why. I just knew I couldn't leave it alone. The site was deserted when I arrived, the machinery silent, the earth eerily still. The pit was still there, gaping like a wound in the ground. But now, it was deeper, its edges crumbling. I stepped closer, peering into the darkness. The air was thick and heavy, the stench of decay overpowering. "Why are you here?" I jumped at the voice and turned to see the coroner standing behind me. Her expression was grim, her face pale in the morning light. "I could ask you the same thing," I replied. She sighed, running a hand through her hair. "I've seen a lot of strange things in my career, but this is something else." We stood in uneasy silence, staring into the pit. "They're not just bones," she said finally. "Whatever they are, they're alive. Or something close to it." Before I could respond, the ground beneath us trembled. A deep rumble, like the growl of some enormous beast, echoed from the pit. "We need to leave," she said, grabbing my arm. But I couldn't move. My gaze was locked on the hole as more forms began to emerge, skeletal hands, twisted figures, their movements unnatural and jerky. And then the whispers returned, louder now, almost deafening. The coroner pulled harder, snapping me out of my trance. "Now!" We ran, stumbling over the uneven ground, the whispers chasing us. When we reached the edge of the site, I turned back one last time. The figures were climbing out now, their hollow eyes glowing faintly in the dim light. This wasn't just a graveyard. It was something far worse. And it wasn't staying buried. The town didn't know yet. At least, not entirely. Whispers of bones and old burial sites spread, but no one understood the scope of what was happening. Pete and I knew the truth, or as much of it as we dared to admit to ourselves. The coroner, Emily, stayed with me after that night. She wasn't just afraid of what she'd seen, she was determined to uncover what we were dealing with. "Henry, this is bigger than us," she said as we sat in my kitchen. She had spread her notes and old maps across the table, her glasses perched on her nose. "There's no record of a cemetery here. But this land, it was something else entirely." "What do you mean?" I asked, already dreading the answer. She pointed to a map from the late 1800s. This area wasn't just unsettled, it was avoided. There are no structures, no markings. It's like the settlers knew to stay away. And now we've dug it up, I muttered. She nodded grimly. Whatever we disturbed, it's been waiting. By the next evening, the situation had escalated. Pete called me, his voice frantic. They're in my house, Henry. I can hear them in the walls. I rushed to his place, my truck skidding on the gravel road as I sped through the quiet streets. His house was dark when I arrived, every window shut tight. Pete, I shouted, pounding on the door. There was no response. I pushed the door open, stepping into the stifling silence. The air was thick, carrying that same rancid smell from the pit. Pete. I called again, my voice trembling. From upstairs, I heard a faint sound. A scrape, followed by a low, guttural whisper. I climbed the stairs slowly, each creak of the wood echoing in the quiet. At the top, the hallway stretched out in front of me, every door closed except one, the door to Pete's bedroom. The whispering grew louder as I approached, the words incomprehensible but filled with malice. I pushed the door open. Pete was there, sitting on the edge of his bed. His eyes were wide, his face pale. They're here, he whispered, not looking at me. They don't want us to leave. Pete, we have to go, I said, stepping closer. He shook his head. It's too late. They're everywhere. The shadows in the room shifted, and I realized with horror that they weren't just shadows. Figures moved in the corners, their skeletal forms twisting unnaturally. One stepped forward, its empty eye sockets locking onto me. Run, Pete said, his voice barely audible. Before they take you too. I grabbed his arm, trying to pull him up, but he didn't move. He just stared at the creature, his face blank with terror. The figure lunged. I don't remember how I got out. The next thing I knew, I was in my truck, speeding away from the house. My hands shook as I gripped the wheel, Pete's screams echoing in my ears. Emily was waiting for me when I got back. One look at my face, and she knew something had happened. Pete's gone, I said, my voice breaking. She placed a hand on my shoulder, her expression grim. We don't have much time, Henry. If they're spreading, we need to figure out how to stop this. I nodded, but I wasn't sure there was a way to stop it. Whatever we had unearthed, it wasn't just going to go back into the ground. But we had to try. That night, we returned to the site, armed with whatever we could find, flashlights, shovels, and a growing sense of desperation. The pit was deeper now, its edges crumbling into the void. The air was alive with whispers, the ground trembling beneath our feet. As we approached, Emily stopped suddenly. Do you hear that? I strained to listen. Among the whispers, a new sound emerged, a low, rhythmic chanting. They're not just moving, she said, her voice trembling. They're summoning something. The realization hit me like a punch to the gut. This wasn't just about the bones. This was something far older, far darker. And it was waking up. The pit was alive. Shadows writhed at its edges, spilling out like ink across the ground. The chanting grew louder, echoing from the depths and vibrating through the air. Emily and I stood frozen, staring into the abyss. The flashlights in our hands flickered weakly, their beams swallowed by the oppressive darkness. We need to stop it, Emily said, her voice a strained whisper. How? I asked. My voice cracked as I spoke, the weight of fear bearing down on me. She didn't answer. Instead, she stepped forward, her gaze fixed on the pit. "Emily, don't." I grabbed her arm, but she shook me off. "We have no choice, Henry," she said, her voice firm despite the terror in her eyes. "If we don't act now, it'll consume everything." I wanted to argue, to pull her away, but deep down, I knew she was right. Emily knelt at the edge of the pit, pulling an old book from her bag. She had found it earlier that day, buried among the notes and maps she'd collected. Its pages were brittle, the writing faded, but it contained something she believed could help, a ritual to seal what lay beneath. She began to read, her voice trembling but steady. The words were foreign, their meaning lost to time, but they carried a weight that seemed to reverberate through the air. As she spoke, the ground trembled violently. The shadows recoiled, writhing as though in pain. The chanting from the pit faltered, replaced by a low, guttural growl. "It's working," she said, glancing back at me. "Keep the light on me." I aimed my flashlight at her, the beam shaking as my hands trembled. The shadows seemed to retreat from the light, their movements frantic. But then, the growl deepened and the pit erupted. A massive figure emerged, its form shrouded in darkness. Its skeletal frame was impossibly large, its eye sockets glowing with an otherworldly light. It towered over us, its presence suffocating. Emily froze, the book slipping from her hands. "Keep going," I shouted, my voice barely audible over the roar of the creature. She scrambled to pick up the book, but the creature lunged. I acted without thinking, throwing myself at Emily and knocking her out of the way. The creature's massive hand slammed into the ground where she had been, the impact sending shockwaves through the earth. We both scrambled to our feet, but the creature was relentless. It moved with a terrifying speed, its skeletal limbs clawing at the ground as it advanced. "This isn't going to work," I shouted. "It has to," Emily yelled back, her eyes wild. She began the ritual again, her voice rising above the chaos. The creature howled, its movements becoming erratic. But then, it stopped. For a moment, everything was still. The creature turned its glowing eyes toward me, and I felt a cold unlike anything I'd ever known. "Run," Emily whispered, her voice breaking. Before I could react, the creature lunged again, this time straight for her. The explosion of light was blinding. I shielded my eyes, stumbling backward as the ground beneath me seemed to give way. When I opened them again, the creature was gone. And so was Emily. The pit was silent now, its edges crumbling inward as though it were collapsing on itself. The whispers had stopped, the air clear of the oppressive weight that had hung over us. But the cost was too great. I stood there for what felt like hours, staring at the spot where Emily had been. Her book lay nearby, its pages charred and torn. In the days that followed, the town seemed to forget. The construction site was abandoned, the land left to reclaim itself. No one mentioned the bones or the pit, as though it had all been a bad dream. But I couldn't forget. Every night, I heard the whispers. They were faint now, like echoes from a distant place, but they were there. I knew they were waiting for someone else to dig too deep. Crossroads of fate. I never meant to end up here. Wyoming, a state that felt endless and desolate, a place where nothing ever seemed to happen. But on this particular night, everything felt different. I had just finished a long shift at the truck stop. The moon hung low in the sky, casting long shadows over the highway that stretched out like a silver ribbon through the emptiness. It was quiet, eerily so. Most of the truckers had already pulled out for the night. The place was dead, save for a few stragglers sipping coffee in the corner booth. I was about to lock up when I heard the sound. At first, it was faint, just a slight rustle from the far end of the lot. I figured it was just the wind, stirring the dry grass or some critter scurrying through the underbrush. But then the sound grew louder, clearer, something walking. Slow, deliberate steps, each one heavy and uneven. I stepped toward the window and peered into the dark. The highway was empty, but the sound persisted, drawing closer. My heart raced. I couldn't explain it, but something about the rhythm of those steps felt wrong. I shook my head, telling myself it was nothing. Probably just a trucker coming back, I muttered under my breath. But my feet remained rooted to the spot, my hands tightening around the edge of the counter. It was then I saw it. A figure, moving slowly from the shadows, stepping into the dim light of the truck stop parking lot. At first glance, it seemed like any other traveler, a man, tall and thin, dressed in worn clothing, his face obscured by the brim of his hat. But as he came closer, I realized something was off. He was walking in a strange, jerky manner, like he was dragging something behind him. The closer he got, the more I could make out, his face, pale and gaunt, his eyes sunken and dark. His clothes were ragged, covered in dirt and grime. He didn't look like someone who had just been on the road for a long haul. He looked wrong. My throat tightened as I watched him come nearer, his steps never faltering, his gaze never shifting. He was locked on something I couldn't see, but it seemed to pull him forward like a magnet. My mind raced, trying to find an explanation. Maybe he's just lost, I whispered to myself, though I knew it didn't make sense. This stretch of highway was barely used by travelers. There was no reason for him to be out here, especially not this late. I backed away from the window, my heart pounding in my chest. Something about the situation felt off, but I couldn't put my finger on it. I didn't know this man, but for some reason, I felt an overwhelming urge to get away. That's when I heard it, the unmistakable sound of footsteps following the man, coming from the other side of the parking lot. A second pair of steps, slow and dragging, just like the first. The hairs on the back of my neck stood up. I couldn't see anyone else, but I could hear the unmistakable sound of movement, as though something, or someone, was trailing behind him. I stepped back into the shadows of the store, hiding behind the counter. My breaths were shallow, my fingers gripping the edge of the counter so tightly my knuckles turned white. I had to stay calm. I had to keep it together. But what was happening? Who were these people, and why were they walking like that? I glanced through the window again, the blood rushing in my ears. The man was now standing in the middle of the lot, facing the truck stop entrance, his head tilted slightly as if he was listening for something. Behind him, I saw it, the shadows. Dark, moving figures that seemed to materialize out of the very night. They were there, but just barely, like shapes formed from smoke, twisting and turning in the periphery of my vision. And then it hit me. They weren't walking. They were dragging themselves, crawling in some unnatural way. Their bodies barely scraped the ground, leaving behind deep, unnatural gouges in the dirt. And their eyes, they shone, like mirrors reflecting the moonlight. A chill ran down my spine. I had to move. I had to do something. But the only thing I could think to do was freeze, to wait, to listen. Suddenly, the door to the truck stop banged open, and in came another man, this one much younger, his eyes wide and frantic. He was stumbling, running as if his life depended on it. "I saw them," he gasped, his voice hoarse, barely able to speak through his panic. "I saw them. The shadows. The figures. They're everywhere." He collapsed into a chair, shaking violently. I wanted to help him, but before I could say anything, his eyes locked onto the window. His face went pale, his hands trembling as he pointed. They're out there." I followed his gaze. The lot was empty now. No figures. No dragging footsteps. Nothing. The air was still. I turned back to the young man, but when I looked at him again, his face had changed. His eyes were no longer filled with fear. They were empty. Blank. His lips parted as if he was about to say something, but instead, all that came out was a hollow whisper. "Don't go outside. They'll follow you." And then, just like that, he was gone, vanished into thin air, leaving only the faintest trace of a chill behind him. I stepped back, my mind reeling. What had just happened? What was I dealing with? And who were those figures, the ones that had followed him here? I didn't know it then, but this was just the beginning. The first of many strange and terrifying encounters. I would never be the same after tonight. The night felt colder now, even with the heater running in the corner of the truck stop. The silence that had returned was oppressive, thick with something I couldn't put my finger on. I kept glancing nervously toward the door, half expecting the young man to reappear, or for the figures from the shadows to materialize once again. But the lot remained empty. The only sound now was the soft hum of the lights and the occasional hiss of the heater. I didn't know what to do. I wasn't even sure if I should lock up and go home, or if something worse was waiting for me outside. The young man's warning echoed in my mind, and I found myself pacing around the small, dimly lit store, unable to shake the feeling that something was watching me. It wasn't until a faint, distant sound broke the stillness that I froze. It was a low scraping noise, like something dragging across the pavement. The sound was barely there at first, just a faint, almost imperceptible shift in the night's quiet. But then it grew louder, more distinct. My heart rate quickened as I crept toward the window again. Out there, in the middle of the parking lot, a shadow shifted. It was low to the ground, creeping along the asphalt, leaving behind a trail of disturbed dirt, much like the young man had described. But this shadow wasn't alone. There were more small, twitching shapes, moving in and out of view, their eyes glinting in the dim light. I held my breath, afraid to make a sound. The figures were coming closer. One of them, larger than the others, paused right in front of the truck stop, its head jerking back and forth, as though listening. Its eyes reflected the light, two glowing orbs that seemed to burn through the night. It looked familiar. I couldn't place it at first, but then I realized this creature, or whatever it was, resembled the man who had entered the store earlier. The same ragged clothes, the same twisted movements. But this time, there was no doubt this wasn't a man. It was something else, something far darker, its limbs twitching unnaturally, its mouth open in a silent snarl. I stepped back from the window, my breath shallow and panicked. I could feel the blood pounding in my temples, a sense of dread washing over me. I had to get out. I had to leave. But the door, of course, the door was locked. I fumbled with the keys, but my hands were shaking too much. The scraping sound outside grew louder, closer. I looked back toward the window, but I couldn't see the shadow anymore. It was as if it had disappeared into thin air. Or worse, it was right outside, watching me. I quickly turned the key in the lock and pushed the door open, stepping out into the night, my senses on high alert. The chill in the air cut through me like a knife, and the moon seemed unnaturally bright, casting long, distorted shadows over the empty parking lot. The scrape of claws against concrete echoed in the distance, but there was no sign of the creatures. No sign of the young man. I forced myself to breathe, to think. I couldn't afford to lose my composure. I had to find a way to get out of here before whatever this was, whatever had been haunting me, found me again. My eyes scanned the parking lot, but there was nothing, only the flickering light of the truck stop and the endless highway stretching ahead, quiet and empty. It was then that I noticed something strange. The trail of dirt. It was leading away from the truck stop, following the path to the woods that bordered the highway. But it wasn't just a trail anymore, it was a circle, a spiral of disturbed earth, winding its way deeper into the shadows. The ground was disturbed, clotted, like something had been circling, waiting. I stood frozen, staring at the mark, and suddenly, it hit me, the sound from before, the dragging steps, the shadowed figures, it was all connected. They weren't just random creatures. They were waiting for something. Waiting for me. I didn't know what kind of force I was dealing with, but I knew one thing, it wasn't something I could explain. Something in my gut told me that if I stayed here much longer, I would be next. I took a hesitant step toward the woods, feeling the hairs on the back of my neck stand up as the world around me seemed to shift. The night was no longer still. The air had changed, it was thick with something ancient, something that pressed against my chest, making it harder to breathe. And then, a soft voice broke the silence. "Get out of here." I whipped around, but no one was there. The voice was faint, almost a whisper, but it had been real, and it had come from behind me. Before I could react, the sound of heavy footsteps returned, louder now, coming from the woods. Something, or someone, was moving toward me. The dragging sound. The scraping. I bolted. There was no hesitation, no second thoughts. I ran toward the truck stop, my footsteps pounding on the asphalt, my breath coming in ragged gasps. I didn't know what was behind me, but I couldn't afford to look back. I reached the door and shoved it open, slamming it shut behind me, locking it again, my heart hammering in my chest. I pressed my back against the door, gasping for air, my body trembling from the adrenaline. But the sounds didn't stop. They were closer now, right outside the door. The dragging sound grew louder, accompanied by soft, scraping whispers that echoed through the walls. And then, a single word whispered on the wind. "Leave." I couldn't stay here anymore. Whatever this was, it had found me. The walls of the truck stop felt suffocating now, the silence between each scrape of claws and every whisper seeming to close in around me. My eyes darted to the windows, the faint glow of the moonlight casting eerie shadows across the lot. I couldn't escape the feeling that the very air was thick with something watching, waiting. I was trapped. The door was locked, but for how long? I could hear the sound now, growing more distinct with every passing second. The dragging, scraping, like something moving slowly but surely toward me, its weight crushing the ground beneath it. Whatever was outside wasn't in a hurry. It was deliberate. It knew I was here. And I could no longer convince myself that it was just my imagination. My heart raced, pounding in my chest, and my breathing became shallow. I had to do something. I glanced around the small store, searching for something, anything that could help. The counter, the kitchen door, the exit at the back. The shelves were lined with mundane items, snacks, drinks, cleaning supplies. None of it would help me now. I needed a way out. But the only door out was locked, and the back exit? I doubted it would provide any escape. I glanced at the door again. The sound was louder now, just outside. The scraping was joined by a low growl, a deep, rumbling noise that seemed to reverberate through the very foundation of the truck stop. It was closer. I stumbled toward the counter, my mind racing. What if I tried to barricade the door? If whatever was outside was going to get in, I might at least have a few extra minutes. My hands trembled as I grabbed the nearest object, a small chair. I pushed it against the door, but it was barely a distraction. The growling grew more intense, louder, and suddenly I heard the unmistakable sound of claws scraping across the wood. I froze. A thick, moist breath exhaled through the cracks of the door, and then another whisper. It was louder this time. Get out. I couldn't think. My brain was overloaded with terror, fighting to make sense of the impossibility of it all. This wasn't normal. None of this was normal. I was being haunted by something that shouldn't exist. And yet, here I was, alone, trapped, and hearing the unmistakable signs of something stalking me. But just as the panic began to take hold, a part of me, the rational part, fought back. I couldn't let myself break. I couldn't let this thing consume me. I grabbed my phone from the counter and quickly dialed 911, my fingers fumbling with the buttons. The phone rang once, twice, no answer. I hit redial, praying for help, but still nothing. A third attempt. Nothing. I slammed the phone down. There was no help coming. The scraping sound outside paused. The silence was thick, suffocating. It lasted just long enough for me to wonder whether I had imagined it. And then, the door began to shudder. At first, it was a faint vibration, but then the force behind it grew. The scraping intensified, like claws raking against wood, teeth gnashing through the thin barrier. The door shuddered again, harder this time. I grabbed a nearby broom, desperate for anything to defend myself, but I knew it was useless. The door gave way with a sharp crack. A rush of cold air hit me, and I stumbled backward, gasping. The creatures were right outside. The shadows in the parking lot seemed to stretch, twisting and shifting as if alive. In the dim light, I saw the silhouettes of massive forms, their glowing eyes peering through the cracks in the door, watching me. I knew then that I couldn't outrun this. I couldn't fight it. I ran. I didn't know where to go, just that I couldn't stay here any longer. I ran for the back exit, my footsteps echoing in the silence, but as soon as I reached the door, I realized it was locked. My mind raced, my thoughts scrambled. I turned to face the main entrance, now wide open, the shadows creeping toward me like a slow tide, pushing me further into the store. I was cornered. The growling, the scraping, the whispers, they grew louder, all around me. The ground beneath me seemed to shift, as though it too was part of the madness closing in. The walls trembled, and the floor seemed to pulse with some terrible energy. And then, through the chaos, I heard something that made my blood run cold, a low, twisted laugh. It was coming from everywhere, echoing off the walls, vibrating through my skull. Too late. A figure stepped through the door. It was tall, impossibly tall, its body cloaked in shadow, its movements unnatural. It was the same figure I had seen earlier, only now it seemed different. The distorted, twitching form of the young man who had warned me stood before me, his face contorted into a twisted smile. But there was nothing human left in him. This wasn't a man. This was something worse. I felt my legs give way beneath me. My knees hit the floor with a sickening thud. I couldn't look away. The figure's eyes glowed with an unnatural light, and its grin stretched impossibly wide. It stepped closer, its form shifting as if it were made of shadows, of darkness. The scraping continued, louder, relentless, as though the entire world was about to collapse in on itself. I could feel the weight of it, the weight of the darkness that was swallowing me whole. The creature towered over me, and I could no longer breathe. The air was thick, oppressive, as though everything was being drawn into that one point, into its eyes. "Get out of here," it whispered again, but this time it was different. The voice was my own. And then, the world went black. I don't know how long I was unconscious. The last thing I remembered was that laugh, and then the overwhelming darkness. But now, when I opened my eyes, I was somewhere else. The ground beneath me was soft, almost as if I were lying on thick, damp soil. The air was cold, too cold, and smelled of earth and decay. My limbs felt heavy, sluggish, like I had been trapped in this place for hours or days. But I knew it couldn't have been that long. I had just been standing in the truck stop, surrounded by shadows, and now I was here. Wherever here was. I pushed myself up, feeling the ground shift beneath me. A sudden wave of dizziness washed over me, and I stumbled to my feet. My hands reached out to steady myself, but the coldness of the air cut through my skin like ice. I could hear nothing. No wind. No sounds of traffic from the road. The usual noises of life had all but vanished. It was just still silence. And then, in the distance, I saw something. A faint glow. It flickered like a dying flame. At first, I thought it was my mind playing tricks on me, but as I focused, I could make out shapes, figures, moving toward the light. I couldn't make out their details, but I knew they were coming closer. They were coming for me. I turned to run, but my legs felt weak. I could barely make a step without feeling like the world would collapse beneath me. The cold was seeping into my bones, and I felt a gnawing sense of dread crawl through my chest. I tried to scream, but no sound came. I had no voice. I was completely alone in this strange, silent world. The flickering light grew brighter, and with it, the figures grew clearer. They were tall, humanoid, but their features, they were wrong. Distorted. Twisted. The shapes of people, but their limbs were too long, their heads too large. Their eyes glowed, those same glowing eyes that had haunted me at the truck stop. And their mouths, stretched wide in sickening, unnatural grins. I had to get away. I couldn't stay here, surrounded by these things, these monsters. I took a step, then another, my feet slipping in the cold mud. My breath came in ragged gasps, and I could feel the panic building inside me, clawing at my throat. But the figures were closer now. One of the monsters, stepped forward, its long, thin arm reaching out. I tried to turn and run, but my legs gave out beneath me. I fell, scraping my hands against the wet ground as I tried to push myself up. But I couldn't move fast enough. A low growl rumbled from behind me, and I felt the ground beneath me vibrate. It was too late. I turned to face it. A massive, twisted creature stood before me. Its skin was like rotting flesh, its body hunched over, crawling on all fours. Its eyes glowed, impossibly bright, like two balls of fire burning through the darkness. Its teeth were sharp, jagged, and they gleamed as it opened its mouth, releasing a low hiss. The creature stepped closer, its breath hot and foul against my face. I could feel the heat of its body, the suffocating weight of its presence. It spoke. "You're still here." I tried to scream, but no sound escaped. My throat was dry, constricted with fear. I couldn't move. I was paralyzed. The creature leaned in closer, its glowing eyes locked onto mine. Its mouth opened wider, and I could see the sharp teeth, the glistening saliva dripping from its jaws. Too late, it whispered, its voice a distorted mockery of the young man I had seen at the truck stop. "This is your fate." Suddenly, everything around me went cold. The light, the glow of the creatures, flickered and vanished, replaced by a deep, oppressive darkness. The creature's form dissolved into the shadows, and I was left alone once again. The ground began to shake beneath me, and I felt myself being pulled downward. I tried to grasp at the air, but it slipped through my fingers. The world around me was collapsing. I was being swallowed whole by the darkness. I opened my mouth to scream, but no sound came. And then, just as suddenly as it had started, the shaking stopped. I was back in the truck stop. The shelves were still lined with snacks and drinks, the counter still empty, the door, thankfully, still shut. The coldness was gone, but my heart was still pounding in my chest. My skin was slick with sweat, and I couldn't catch my breath. I wasn't sure if I had been in a dream or if I was still in one. I glanced at the door. The creatures, they were gone. But I couldn't shake the feeling that they were still out there, watching, waiting. And then, the door opened. The growling was back. The scraping, the whispers, all of it. I could hear them, closing in. And I knew, deep down, that there was no escaping. It was too late. The door creaked open, and I froze, my body unwilling to move. A chill swept over me, sharp and biting, the same cold I'd felt in the tunnel, no, the abyss, just moments ago. My hands trembled at my sides, and I couldn't tell whether I was awake or still trapped in that nightmare. But it didn't matter. The world was shifting, bending, changing around me, and I felt every second of it. The growl from behind the door grew louder, deeper, filling the space with its guttural vibrations. It was unmistakable now. The creatures were back, or perhaps they had never left. I didn't know. It didn't matter. The only thing I could focus on was the sound of their footsteps. Heavy, deliberate. They were coming for me. I looked around the room. The familiar truck stopped suddenly, feeling alien and hostile. The counter, the rows of snacks and drinks, everything felt wrong. The flickering fluorescent lights buzzed in a way they never had before, and the air was thick, like it was being squeezed through a vice. I glanced at the door again. The handle was slowly turning. In that moment, the silence shattered. The door flew open with a force that rattled the walls. The creatures poured in, their forms like nightmares made flesh. Their glowing eyes were fixed on me, their twisted grins widening as they drew closer, their long limbs reaching out to pull me into the darkness. I stumbled back, my breath coming in ragged gasps. Panic surged through me like a tidal wave, drowning any rational thought. This couldn't be happening. Not again. I had to fight. I had to escape. I couldn't just be their prey. I turned to the window, but it was too late. The monsters were already blocking my only way out. Their shadows stretched across the room like claws, closing in from every angle. There was nowhere to go. One of them, the largest, stepped forward. It towered over me, its body deformed, its eyes burning into mine. It let out a low, mocking laugh, a sound so terrifying, so unnatural, I almost felt my mind unravel. "Running won't help you," it hissed, its voice like 1,000 whispers tangled together. "You're already here." I could feel my knees giving out, the weight of the terror too much to bear. I sank to the floor, helpless. The creatures circled me, their presence suffocating. Every breath I took felt like it was stolen from me. But even in the face of this, a part of me, somewhere deep inside, refused to give up. The survival instinct kicked in. I couldn't die like this. Not after everything. Not after coming this far. I reached into my pocket, my hand brushing against the cold metal of my knife. It was small, useless against the horror surrounding me, but it was all I had. With shaking hands, I pulled it out, gripping it tightly. The creature closest to me tilted its head, as if amused. Is that supposed to stop us? I didn't care what it thought. The knife wasn't for the creature. It was for me. Without warning, I pressed the blade to my wrist. The cold steel against my skin felt oddly comforting, a promise of control in a world that had spun completely out of mine. I could end it. I could stop the madness. I wouldn't be swallowed whole by this nightmare. But the moment I made the cut, something shifted. The world around me flickered, and for a split second, the creatures paused. Their eyes dimmed, their forms flickering like fading shadows. The growling stopped, and the buzzing lights overhead hummed to life again. The creatures recoiled, and I felt the pressure in the air lift. But before I could understand what was happening, the ground beneath me gave way, and I was falling once more. The last thing I saw before everything went black was the twisted grin of the creature fading into the abyss, and the chilling whisper that followed me down. "You can't escape." When I woke again, I wasn't in the truck stop. I was in the tunnel. The same one I had seen earlier, its walls slick with moisture, its air thick with the smell of decay. But this time, I wasn't alone. They were there, waiting for me. The creatures. The shadows. They had come for me, but I had already known they would. There would be no escaping. The Old Mirror. It was a quiet Sunday afternoon when Sarah and I made the decision. We had spent months looking for something, anything, that could fill the empty space in our new home. The house was big, a little too big for just the two of us, and the walls seemed to close in, pressing on us both. We thought a few antiques might bring some warmth to the place. The shop in Louisiana was small but filled with relics from another time. Dust clung to everything. Old wooden shelves, brass fixtures, faded portraits, items that spoke of lives lived long before we arrived. Among the clutter, an old mirror stood in the corner, tucked between a pair of tarnished candlesticks and a broken rocking chair. I felt it before I saw it, a chill that wrapped around my spine and whispered through the air. The mirror wasn't anything special, not at first glance. Its frame was dark wood, intricately carved, but worn with age. The glass was cloudy, just enough to distort the reflection, but I couldn't look away. It felt strange, as if it was waiting for something. I turned to Sarah, half expecting her to suggest we leave. "Do you see that?" I asked, my voice low, unsure if I was just imagining things. She had already walked up to it, her fingers trailing along the frame, and smiled. "It's beautiful," she said, her tone light, almost too light. There was something in her eyes, something familiar but off. I couldn't quite place it. I could have sworn I saw the reflection of someone standing just behind her, but when I blinked, the mirror was empty. It was the price that finally convinced us. $200, a steal, the owner claimed. Sarah was drawn to it, her enthusiasm infectious. It was as if the mirror had cast a spell on her. I didn't argue. If it made her happy, then it was worth it. The owner, an old man with yellow teeth and wrinkled skin, wrapped it carefully in brown paper. His hands trembled slightly, and his eyes never quite met mine. He seemed eager to be rid of it. "It's an antique," he said with a gravelly voice, "but it's more than that, you know? Be careful with it." We loaded into the back of our car. The drive home was uneventful, but as we got closer to the house, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was following us, just out of sight. By the time we got inside, it was evening, and the house felt colder than before. We set the mirror in the living room, facing the front door. I remember the way it caught the dim light, casting strange, elongated shadows on the walls. Sarah smiled again, running her fingers across the glass. "I love it," she said softly, as if trying to convince herself. I didn't answer. I just stood there, watching, as if waiting for something. It wasn't until later that night, after dinner, that things started to shift. We were both sitting on the couch when I heard the soft rustle, like something moving behind me. I glanced over my shoulder, but the mirror only reflected the dim light from the hallway. Nothing else. I turned back, but I couldn't ignore the feeling, the pressure building behind me. I leaned forward, my gaze flickering once more to the reflection in the mirror. This time, there was something different. The shadows were no longer just shadows. They were moving. I stood up quickly, my heart racing. Sarah didn't seem to notice. She was lost in her own thoughts, staring blankly at the flickering TV. My breath quickened. The longer I looked at the mirror, the more I felt it, something pulling at me, as if the reflection was trying to reach out, to drag me into it. "Sarah," I said, trying to steady my voice. "Did you see that?" She glanced at me, confused. "See what?" I opened my mouth to explain, but the words caught in my throat. The room felt thick, suffocating, as though the air itself had changed. I turned away, feeling the weight of the mirror pressing down on me. It was ridiculous. I had to be imagining it. There was no way something as simple as an old mirror could be. The rustle came again, louder this time, and I spun around. The mirror reflected nothing but the dim room, but I could hear it. A low whisper, too soft to understand, but unmistakable. It was coming from the mirror. "Sarah." My voice trembled, panic creeping in. "We need to get rid of it. Now." But she didn't hear me. She was already too far gone. The next day, Sarah seemed distant. Her eyes were hollow, her movements slow. She didn't want to talk, didn't want to explain what had happened. I told myself it was just stress, that the mirror was just an old relic with no power to cause harm. But I could still hear the whisper. As the days passed, I began to notice more things. Little changes. The temperature in the house dropped, especially near the mirror. It wasn't just the cold air, it felt like something was watching us. I could never shake the feeling of being observed, and whenever I glanced at the mirror, there was always something more, something moving in the corner of my eye, a shadow that didn't belong. I tried to avoid it, but it was impossible. I'd catch glimpses of myself in the reflection, only it wasn't quite me. The face that stared back was different. Older. More worn. It was as if the mirror was showing something from the past, something that had never been there before. And then one night, it happened. The whispering grew louder until it was almost a chant, an unintelligible murmur. I walked toward the mirror, unable to resist. My reflection looked back at me. No, not me. Someone else. A man, pale and gaunt, with eyes that gleamed with malice. I reached for the mirror, my breath shallow. The glass was cold, unnaturally so. And as my fingers brushed against it, a sudden force yanked me forward, pulling me into the reflection. Everything went dark. I struggled to breathe, but the air was thick, stagnant. My body felt heavy, as if I were trapped in quicksand, unable to move or scream. The darkness enveloped me completely, and for a moment, I thought I might suffocate. My heart pounded, louder and louder, until it drowned out all other sounds. I could hear it, the low hum of something distant, something ancient, as though it were coming from the very walls around me. My head spun. I tried to pull back, but my hand remained glued to the mirror's surface, the coldness seeping through my skin. Then, slowly, the world began to shift. The darkness parted, and I found myself standing in a dimly lit room. The walls were old, cracked, their paint peeling away like dead skin. There was no door, no windows, just an endless, oppressive space. I wasn't alone. Figures moved around me, but they didn't seem to notice me. They were fading, like shadows in a half-forgotten dream. They were dressed in old, ragged clothes, their faces hidden by layers of dirt and grime. I could hear them whispering, but their voices were muffled, like they were speaking from underwater. My breath caught as I recognized them. These weren't just shadows. They were the reflections in the mirror. The pale man with hollow eyes. The twisted, wrinkled faces of people long forgotten. They were real, and they were trapped here. And somehow, I had joined them. A scream ripped through me, but it was swallowed by the thick air, and no one reacted. I tried to move, to escape, but my legs wouldn't obey. I stumbled forward, desperate to find a way out, but the space stretched impossibly before me, a never-ending maze of faces and shadows. The whispers grew louder, more frantic, urging me to listen, to understand. Then, just as I thought I would lose my mind, I saw it. A figure, tall, cloaked in darkness, standing at the far end of the room. Its eyes gleamed like cold fire, burning with a hunger I couldn't comprehend. And in its hands, it held something, a mirror, identical to the one I had brought home. The mirror seemed to pulse with a life of its own. The figure stepped toward me, and I couldn't stop myself from moving closer, drawn in by some force beyond my control. I reached out, my fingers trembling, but before I could touch it, a voice, sharp, cutting through the silence, spoke. "Do you know what you've done?" I turned to see the pale man from earlier, his face twisted in an agonizing expression. His eyes were wide with terror, his mouth moving in a silent scream. "You shouldn't have touched it," he whispered, his voice barely audible over the rising murmur. "It sees. It remembers. It takes." Suddenly, everything became clear. The mirror wasn't just a reflection. It was a doorway, a passage between worlds. And once you entered, you could never leave. I felt the presence behind me, cold and suffocating, growing closer until I could feel the heat of its breath on my neck. The whispers were louder now, rising to a crescendo. They were coming from all directions, from the shadows, from the figures, from the mirror itself. The pale man reached out, his hand shaking, and tried to grab my arm. "You're not meant to be here. Get out, before it's too late." But it was too late. I couldn't move. My body felt paralyzed, my mind screaming for release, but I was trapped in this hellish reflection, this nightmare that never ended. The figure in the distance was moving closer now, its eyes gleaming with hunger. "Do you understand?" the pale man hissed. "It takes you. It takes everything." I felt the mirror's grip tightening around me. It was pulling me in, drawing me closer to that cold, empty world. I reached out, but there was nothing left to grab. The last thing I saw was the reflection of my own terrified face, twisted and unrecognizable, staring back at me from the mirror. And then, nothing. The darkness swallowed me whole. The next morning, Sarah was gone. The house was eerily silent. The mirror still stood in the corner, reflecting only the dim light from the window. I had returned, but I wasn't the same. I was part of it now. The whispers, the figures, they followed me. And I knew, deep down, that I could never escape. The mirror had claimed me, and I was just another reflection, another lost soul trapped forever in its cold embrace. And as I stood there, staring into the glass, I saw Sarah. Her face was pale, her eyes hollow. She was standing behind me, just beyond the mirror's surface, reaching out. She was trying to warn me. But I couldn't move. The mirror had me now. And it always would. I woke with a start, heart racing, drenched in sweat. My hand instinctively shot out to the mirror, resting against its cold, smooth surface. The room was still dark, the only light coming from the faintest sliver of moonlight slipping through the blinds. I could hear the wind outside, howling softly, but nothing else seemed real anymore. The nightmare was still fresh in my mind. It felt like a warning, a threat that I couldn't shake. I had to leave. I had to get out of this place, away from the mirror, away from the thing that was calling me. But I couldn't bring myself to move. The mirror, the reflection. It kept pulling at me, drawing me back into its grip. I turned slowly, my gaze drifting to the reflection in the dark glass. There was nothing at first, just the empty room behind me. But then, slowly, it began to change. The shadows in the corners shifted, stretching and lengthening as though something unseen was stirring within them. I blinked, convinced I was imagining it, but when I looked again, the shadows were moving, alive. I rubbed my eyes, trying to clear the sleep from my mind, but it didn't help. The shadows in the mirror seemed to pulse, like living things, swaying gently as though they were watching me. They were waiting. I stumbled back, my breath catching in my throat. No, it wasn't possible. I was imagining it, surely. But as my heart hammered in my chest, the reflection grew more vivid. The shadows were taking shape now. I could see them clearly, dark, distorted forms that crept along the edges of the glass. My skin prickled with cold terror. One of the shadows moved closer, and I froze. I couldn't look away. I didn't want to look away. It was like some invisible force was holding me in place, forcing me to witness what was unfolding in front of me. Then, a figure emerged fully from the darkness. A man, his face pale and twisted with agony, stepped out of the shadow. His clothes were tattered, his eyes wide with fear, his lips moving as though trying to speak. But no sound came. I could see his mouth forming words, but they were drowned by the hum, that terrible noise that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. The man's eyes locked onto mine, his expression was silent desperation. He was reaching out, but his hand was thin, skeletal, and it didn't seem to be moving forward. It was as if something was holding him back, trapping him in the mirror, just like the others I had seen in my nightmare. I tried to turn away, to tear myself from the haunting reflection, but it was as if I couldn't move. My legs refused to obey. I was rooted in place, paralyzed by fear. The man's face twisted in a silent scream. His hand trembled as he reached out again, this time pressing against the glass. I could see the veins in his arm, the thin, fragile skin stretching tight. His eyes were pleading. He needed something, but what? Then, the reflection shifted again. Another figure appeared behind him, taller, darker, more sinister. The figure wore a cloak of shadows, its face hidden beneath a hood, its eyes glowing faintly, like coals smoldering in the dark. The moment it stepped into view, the man in the mirror screamed soundlessly, his form starting to blur and stretch, as if being pulled away. I felt the air around me thicken, like the walls were closing in. The mirror seemed to pulsate, as though it had a heartbeat of its own. The temperature dropped, and my breath came out in short, frantic gasps. The figure in the cloak moved closer, and I could feel its presence, a cold pressure that pressed down on my chest, as though it were suffocating me. I had to move. I had to escape. But no matter how hard I tried to pull away, I couldn't. I couldn't leave. The figure in the mirror was now closer, its eyes piercing into mine, burning with that unholy hunger. My skin crawled, my mind screamed, but my body wouldn't respond. I was trapped in its gaze, held captive by its stare. Then, with a final, agonizing scream, the man in the mirror disappeared into the darkness. The shadows closed in around him, swallowing him whole. The reflection was empty again, but I could still feel its presence, like a weight pressing down on my soul. I couldn't breathe. I couldn't think. I was alone, but not alone. The mirror held me, and it wouldn't let go. I stumbled back, finally able to move, but my legs gave way beneath me. I collapsed onto the floor, gasping for air, my heart racing uncontrollably. The room was silent again, but the echoes of what I had seen, what I had felt, still lingered. I was awake. I was safe. But I wasn't sure how much longer that would last. The mirror, the thing in the mirror. It wasn't just a reflection. It was alive, and it was watching. I tried to steady my breath, clutching the floor beneath me. The silence of the room felt like a thick, suffocating blanket pressing down on my chest. The mirror, that damn mirror, hung there like a dark void, waiting. I could almost hear it calling to me, whispering in the back of my mind, urging me to look again. But I couldn't. Not after what I had seen. I had to get out. I had to leave. But something was stopping me. It wasn't just fear. It was something deeper, something more insidious. The reflection, that shadowy figure. I couldn't escape it. No matter how far I ran, it would be there, watching. I pulled myself to my feet, still trembling, and took a step toward the door. But as I moved, something caught my eye, a flicker of movement in the mirror. I froze. At first, it was just a blur, an odd distortion of light in the glass, like a shadow passing across the surface. But then it sharpened, becoming more distinct. It was a figure, a woman this time, her long dark hair flowing around her pale face, her expression blank. She didn't move, She just stared directly into the reflection, her eyes empty, hollow. I knew what I had to do. I had to destroy the mirror. Whatever this thing was, whatever was trapped inside, it couldn't be allowed to hold me any longer. But even as the thought crossed my mind, something else happened. A sound. A soft creaking, like the hinges of an old door slowly turning. It was coming from the mirror. I stepped back, feeling my pulse quicken. The woman in the glass didn't move, but the creaking sound grew louder, more pronounced, like something inside the mirror was shifting. Something alive. I took another step back, my mind racing. Was I imagining this? Could this really be happening? The air felt heavy, charged, and the room around me seemed to close in tighter, pressing in from all sides. Then it hit me. I could feel the temperature drop. The chill in the air was unbearable, biting through my skin like icy needles. I looked at the woman again, but now something had changed. Her eyes. They were no longer hollow. They were watching me. A slow, deliberate gaze, as if she was studying me, waiting for me to make my move. My heart raced as I realized the truth. She wasn't just trapped inside the mirror. She was a part of it. A part of whatever dark force had taken hold of the glass. And she wasn't alone. The creaking sound intensified, now joined by the soft scrape of something dragging across the floor. It was coming from within the mirror. The woman's lips parted, and for the first time, she spoke. Her voice was soft at first, almost a whisper, but it grew louder with each word. "Help me," she pleaded. "It's too late for me, but you can still escape." I staggered backward, my breath hitching in my throat. My mind spun, trying to make sense of what was happening. Could I trust her? Or was she part of the trap? The creaking continued, growing louder still, until the mirror began to vibrate, sending a ripple through the surface of the glass. I could see something else now. Shapes, figures, moving in the reflection. Shadows. More shadows, swirling, coalescing, until they took form. I recognized them now. They were the figures from my nightmares, the pale man with the agonized face, the shadowy cloaked figure, and the others. They were all there, trapped in the mirror, moving closer, reaching for me. I could hear the soft scratching of their fingers against the glass, like claws against stone. It was maddening, the sound cutting through my mind like a scream. "Leave," the woman in the mirror whispered urgently. "You have to leave now. They're coming for you." But it was too late. A heavy thud echoed through the room, like something large hitting the ground. And then I heard it, footsteps, dragging across the floor, slow but deliberate. My heart lurched in my chest, and I spun around, searching the room. There was nothing. Nothing but darkness, pressing in from all sides. I could feel the weight of it, the oppressive stillness that seemed to grow thicker by the second. The temperature had dropped even further, and I could see my breath in the air, swirling in front of me like smoke. And then I saw it. A shadow, darker than the darkness itself, moved across the room. It was tall, unnaturally tall, its shape shifting and warping as it glided toward me. The air around it seemed to distort, bending and twisting, as if the very fabric of reality was warping in its presence. I tried to move, to run, but my legs refused to obey. It was as though I was rooted to the spot, paralyzed by terror. The shadow inched closer, its form becoming more defined with each step. I could see its eyes now, glowing faintly, a sickly yellow-green. It was coming for me. "Help me." The woman in the mirror whispered again, her voice barely audible, as if she was being pulled away. "Please." The shadow loomed in front of me, and I could feel its cold breath on my skin. It was close now, so close I could smell it, an acrid, decaying stench that filled the room. Then it reached out, and everything went black. I woke up to an overwhelming silence. My limbs were heavy, and my head throbbed with a dull, persistent ache. I tried to move, but the weight of my body felt like it was stuck in a deep, suffocating pit. It took a moment for my eyes to adjust, for my senses to sharpen enough to comprehend where I was. I was no longer in the room with the mirror. I was somewhere else. The air was thick, stagnant, and the stench of decay was even more pungent here. I tried to breathe deeply, but the smell clung to my throat, making me gag. The walls around me were covered in a damp, black mold, and the floor beneath me was slick with something cold and wet. I couldn't tell if it was blood or something worse. But the worst part, the part that made my blood run cold, was the silence. It wasn't the comfortable quiet of an empty room. No, this silence was wrong. It felt like it was holding its breath, waiting for something. Waiting for me. I pushed myself up with a grunt, my body stiff and sore. My fingers touched the floor, and the slickness beneath them sent a wave of disgust through me. I had to get out. I had to leave this place. But as I stood, my foot slipped in the muck. I reached out to steady myself, and my hand landed on something cold and hard. It was metal, smooth and unyielding. I looked down and saw it clearly, a chain. A heavy, rusted chain connected to a thick metal door. I could just make out its outline, but the door was not like any I had seen before. It was ancient, covered in intricate symbols that twisted and curled like a web of darkness. The chain was secured by a massive lock, the kind you expect to see in a prison, the kind you would need a crowbar to break. A low, guttural sound echoed from somewhere in the darkness, making me freeze. It was a distant whisper, like 1,000 voices murmuring all at once. The air grew colder, and the hairs on the back of my neck stood up. I wasn't alone here. I had to move. My heart pounded against my ribs as I turned away from the door, scanning my surroundings. The room I was in seemed to stretch endlessly, its corners swallowed by shadow. I could make out nothing in the dark, and yet I felt eyes on me. Watching. Something was in here with me. Something ombre. The whispers grew louder, more distinct, and I could swear I heard my name amidst the murmurs, faint at first, but growing clearer with each passing second. Sarah. My blood ran cold. I knew that voice. It was impossible, but it was unmistakable. My sister. Sarah, you're here, too, aren't you? I turned, searching frantically, but the room remained unchanged. Only darkness. The voice continued, each word laced with fear and desperation. You can't escape, Sarah. They won't let you. No one escapes. I swallowed hard, the fear choking me. The room began to spin, and I had to hold onto the wall to steady myself. The shadows shifted, bending and moving, becoming darker and more oppressive. The air thickened until I could barely breathe. My throat burned, and I gasped for air, but nothing came. The door. I had to focus. The door. I staggered toward it, my movements unsteady, as if the darkness itself was trying to pull me back, to hold me in place. The whispers surrounded me now, seeping into my ears, crawling under my skin. The voice of my sister was just a part of it. There were other voices, too, all overlapping, all desperate, all begging, "Sarah, please, don't let them take you." I reached the door, my hands trembling as I fumbled with the lock. The cold metal was slick beneath my fingers, and the rusted chain felt heavier than it should have. I struggled with it, my breath coming in short, ragged gasps. But no matter how much I pulled, the lock refused to give way. The whispers grew louder, more frantic, until they were a deafening roar in my ears. "Sarah!" I screamed, slamming my hand against the door in frustration, but the impact sent a shock through my body, making me stumble back. And that's when I saw it. A shadow emerged from the corner of the room, moving with a predatory grace. At first, I thought it was just my eyes playing tricks on me, but then it moved closer, and I could see it clearly. It was not human. The shape was twisted, like a contorted figure crawling toward me, its limbs unnaturally long and thin. Its face was obscured by the darkness, but I could feel its gaze piercing through me. Cold, malevolent eyes staring right into my soul. I backed away, my legs buckling beneath me. But there was nowhere to go. I was trapped. The creature's whisper echoed in my mind, a low, rumbling voice that seemed to come from everywhere. "You should have never looked into the mirror, Sarah. Now, you belong to us." I tried to scream, but my voice was lost in the thick air. The shadow moved closer, and I could hear its steps now, a slow, deliberate drag across the floor, like the sound of claws scraping against stone. I could feel it closing in, its presence suffocating, its hunger palpable. The door. There was only one way out. With everything I had left, I lunged toward the lock, trying to pry it open. But before I could reach it, the shadow was upon me. I could feel its cold breath on my skin, its claws grazing my arm. And then everything went black. I don't know how much time passed before I woke again. I was no longer in the dark room, no longer trapped by the suffocating air. Instead, I found myself back in the apartment, the one with the mirror. But something was wrong. The room felt different. The air was thick with the same oppressive atmosphere I had felt before, as if the space had been distorted. The mirror was there, in its place, but this time the reflection was not of the room behind me. It was of me. I stood before the mirror, staring into my own eyes. But the reflection was wrong. I wasn't the same. My face was pale, my eyes wide with terror, and my expression, it wasn't mine. It was twisted, distorted, as though something was clawing its way out of me. Then, I saw it. In the reflection, the shadow stood behind me. Its cold eyes gleamed in the glass, and I could feel its presence, like a weight pressing on my chest. It was here, in the real world, and there was no escape. I tried to move, to look away from the mirror, but my body wouldn't respond. My legs felt like they were rooted to the floor, my chest tight with panic. The shadow behind me in the reflection didn't move, but its presence was suffocating, like it was waiting for something. Waiting for me to make the first move. I couldn't breathe. The air seemed to thicken, to twist and turn, like it was closing in on me, squeezing out the last of my sanity. My heart raced, pounding so loudly in my ears that it drowned out the whispers. But I could still feel them. They were everywhere, inside me now, crawling beneath my skin. I tried to scream, but no sound came out. The mirror, the damn mirror. It was alive, somehow, pulling me in, suffocating me in its reflection. The more I looked, the more I felt myself slipping away, as if the room I stood in was fading, and the world around me was becoming more and more distorted. I wanted to look away, but I couldn't. My eyes were locked, my body frozen in place, as if the mirror was controlling me. The shadow in the glass moved then, slowly, deliberately, as if savoring every moment. It extended a long, twisted arm, its fingers stretching impossibly far, reaching toward me. I could feel the coldness of its touch even before it made contact. The fingers, thin and sharp like knives, brushed against the back of my neck, sending a shiver of ice down my spine. My skin tingled, and a surge of dread flooded me. The reflection smiled. It wasn't my smile. It was a grotesque, mocking version of it. I could feel my own face twisting in response to its unholy grin, a smirk that didn't belong to me. My body felt like it was betraying me, like I was no longer in control. The shadow's hand slid down my neck, cold and unyielding. The whispers in my ears grew louder, more insistent. They were all around me now, the voices overlapping, indistinguishable. Some sounded like people I knew, friends, family, but others were foreign, twisted, filled with malice. You can't run from it, Sarah. You can't escape the truth, the reflection said. Its voice was deep, raspy, like the sound of 1,000 broken whispers. This is where you belong. I shook my head, my breath shallow, gasping for air. I wanted to break free, to fight back, but my limbs refused to obey. I felt helpless, trapped in this nightmare where reality and reflection had merged into one. The shadow in the mirror reached out further, pulling at me, dragging me toward the glass. I could feel its icy grip on my arm now, its fingers digging into my skin, tightening with a strength that was beyond human. I tried to scream again, but no sound came. And then, just as I thought I couldn't take it anymore, everything stopped. The room fell silent. The whispers vanished, the air cleared, and for a moment, I was alone. But the silence wasn't comforting, it was more terrifying than anything I had ever known. The shadow in the mirror was gone, and so was the reflection of me. It was as if the mirror had swallowed them both, leaving only emptiness behind. I stepped back, trying to regain my bearings, but I wasn't sure what was real anymore. The mirror remained in front of me, still and undisturbed. My reflection had returned to normal, my wide, panicked eyes staring back at me in the glass. But deep down, I knew something had changed. The mirror had taken something from me, something I couldn't name, something I would never get back. I turned away, my legs shaking as I stumbled out of the room. I had to leave. I had to get out of this place before whatever was in the mirror came for me again. I could still feel it, its presence, waiting, watching. But as I reached the door, I saw it again. My reflection. In the hallway mirror. It was waiting for me. And it wasn't me anymore. Hell on wheels. The sun was setting, painting the desert sky in shades of orange and red, but something about it felt off. A strange stillness hung in the air, thicker than the dry heat that enveloped me. My truck had been running smoothly up until now. But now, in the middle of the vast, unending stretch of Arizona highway, it sputtered, the engine cutting out with a jolt that made my heart skip a beat. I cursed under my breath, my hands gripping the steering wheel tightly as I tried to restart the engine. Nothing. I wasn't exactly surprised. The truck had been having problems for days, little warning lights flickering on the dashboard like ominous premonitions. But now, stranded in the middle of nowhere, I regretted ignoring those signs. The road stretched out behind me like an endless ribbon, a gray serpent winding through the barren landscape, but there was no one in sight. No other cars. Just the desolate silence of the desert. The vast nothingness was both beautiful and suffocating. I turned the key again, but the engine remained dead. No clicking, no just silence. A cold wave of dread washed over me as I stared at the empty road ahead. I knew there was a small rest stop a few miles back, but walking there in this heat, it would be a long and grueling trek. Still, there was nothing else to do. I stepped out of the truck and closed the door behind me, feeling the weight of the silence pressing in on me. As soon as I closed the door, I heard it. A faint sound, just a whisper of wind, or so I thought. But it wasn't the wind. It was a low, scratching noise coming from somewhere nearby. I turned quickly, scanning the empty desert. There was nothing. Just the road, the sand, and the distant silhouette of rocky outcrops. My heart raced, the hairs on the back of my neck prickling with unease. It must have been an animal, I told myself. A coyote, maybe. There were plenty of them around these parts. But the sound wasn't quite right. It was too deliberate, too slow. A scraping, dragging sound that seemed to move closer, though I saw nothing in the desert that could be making it. I took a cautious step toward the front of the truck, then another. My eyes were darting around, trying to catch sight of whatever was out there. But the more I searched, the more unsettled I became. It was like the desert itself was holding its breath. Suddenly, there it was again. The sound. Only this time, it was closer, much closer. It was coming from beneath the truck. My pulse spiked. My mind raced through the possibilities. Could it be a snake? No, the sound was all wrong for that. I took another step back, my legs stiff, the unease in my stomach growing stronger. Focus, I muttered to myself. Just stay calm. It's probably nothing. But it wasn't nothing. There, just underneath the truck, a shadow flickered. The hairs on my neck stood on end. The shadow shifted, twisting unnaturally as it slid from under the truck, and I stumbled back in shock, nearly falling to the ground. The shadow was too long, too thick, moving in a way that didn't belong in this world. My heart thudded in my chest as my eyes locked onto it. Then, I saw the eyes. Small, red pinpricks of light glowing from the shadow, reflecting the fading light of the setting sun. They were too bright, too unnatural. And they were focused on me. Panic surged through me. I backed away slowly, but the shadow followed, moving with a deliberate slowness that felt like it was toying with me. I turned and ran, my boots kicking up dust as I sprinted toward the desert road, the fear bubbling up my throat, choking me. Every step felt heavier than the last, as if the air itself was thickening with each breath. My truck was too far now, and the rest stop was even farther. But the sound, those dragging, scratching noises, continued to follow me, growing louder as I ran. The shadows in the desert seemed to shift, warping around me, and I could feel the temperature drop sharply, a chill that made my skin crawl. The wind picked up, howling across the barren landscape, but even that didn't drown out the sound of whatever was following me. I glanced over my shoulder. The shadow was closer now, moving along the ground like a large, distorted figure. My pulse was hammering in my chest, and I felt a surge of desperation. I had to get to the rest stop. There was no other choice. But just as I thought I could make it, a heavy thud echoed behind me. Then another and another. It was like something large was moving in the dark, something heavy, something that shouldn't be able to move as quietly as it did. The sound of scraping against sand filled the air, and I could feel the vibrations through the ground. I sprinted harder, my legs aching, but every time I looked behind me, the shadows seemed closer. Its eyes, those glowing red eyes, pierced through the darkness, watching me, judging me. And that sound, that dragging scrape, kept getting louder. My thoughts were a mess, my mind spinning with terror. What was that thing? What did it want? I couldn't make sense of it, but the more I thought about it, the more certain I became I wasn't alone out here. As I ran, the desert around me felt more alive, more threatening. The once silent vastness now seemed to be closing in, pressing in from all sides. The ground beneath my feet felt soft, unstable, as if it was shifting in time with the sounds I was hearing. And then, in the distance, I saw it, the flickering light of the rest stop. I was almost there. But the sound wasn't behind me anymore. It was all around me. I didn't stop running until I reached the flickering lights of the rest stop. My lungs were burning, my legs like lead, but I couldn't afford to slow down. The sound of scraping, dragging behind me was getting louder, closer. The shadows, those damn shadows, were stretching unnaturally, slithering over the ground like something alive. I could hear them, feel them, even when I wasn't looking. When I reached the rest stop, I didn't hesitate. I rushed up to the small, battered building, its windows dark and the door ajar, as if it hadn't been used in years. The old sign above the door swung weakly in the wind, creaking with every gust. The eerie, almost mocking sound made my skin crawl even more. I pushed the door open and stumbled inside. The stale, dry air of the building hit me like a wall. It smelled like dust and abandonment, the walls lined with peeling posters of old road maps and advertisements for a gas station long out of service. The flickering lights buzzed overhead, casting strange shadows that seemed to dance in time with the ones outside. I slammed the door behind me and locked it, my breath coming in ragged gasps. I was safe, for now. But the feeling of being safe didn't last long. The building didn't feel right. It was too quiet, the kind of quiet that makes you feel like something's waiting just beyond your perception. I strained my ears, trying to listen for any sign of life. But there was nothing. Not even the sound of the wind outside. I moved cautiously toward the counter, scanning the dimly lit room. The rest stop had clearly been abandoned for years. The counter was empty, and the shelves were covered in a thick layer of dust. There were no signs of recent human activity, no traces of anything that could explain what was happening outside. I checked the small door behind the counter, but it was locked. Figures. No help from the inside. The scraping sound outside had stopped, but now there was something worse. A strange clicking, like claws tapping against metal. I froze, my body tensing at the noise. It was close, too close. I dared to peek through the small window beside the door, but the only thing I saw was darkness. And then I noticed something that made my blood run cold, the reflection in the glass. It wasn't just my face staring back at me. A dark shape, a silhouette, stood just behind me, out of focus at first, but slowly coming into view as it took shape. I wanted to scream, to move, but I couldn't. My body was frozen in place. The figure was tall, unnaturally tall, its outline blurred, like it was made of shadows. And there, glowing in the darkness, were two small, red dots. Eyes. I whipped around, but there was nothing there. My heart hammered in my chest as I turned back to the window. The figure was gone, but those eyes, they were still there, still glowing in the glass, staring right at me. My breath caught in my throat. I stumbled back from the window, knocking into a shelf. It rattled, and some old cans fell to the ground, the sound deafening in the silence of the room. I jumped, my nerves on edge, and my eyes darted around the space. The clicking noise grew louder again. Closer. Closer. I wasn't alone. I backed toward the counter, my eyes darting toward the door, desperate to find some way out, but it was too late. I could hear the scraping again. This time it was accompanied by the sound of something large moving, something massive, dragging itself across the sand. The door rattled violently as something slammed against it from the outside. The whole building seemed to shake with the impact. I stumbled back, my feet tangled in the debris from the fallen cans, but I couldn't take my eyes off the door. I didn't know what was out there, but whatever it was relentless. I had to do something. Anything. I grabbed the nearest object, a rusted metal rod, and held it out in front of me, my hand shaking uncontrollably. The rod felt useless in my grip, but it was all I had. I didn't know what I was preparing for, but I couldn't stand there and wait to be consumed by whatever was out there. Then came the sound again, the scraping, dragging, relentless sound, closer now, unmistakably coming from inside the rest stop. I turned, my breath coming in ragged gasps. A massive shadow moved across the floor. I could see it just beyond the dim light, moving like a wave of darkness, coiling itself into the space. The eyes, the red eyes, shone brightly now, gleaming from the shape of a gigantic, monstrous rodent. Its body was grotesque, unnatural, with patches of fur missing, and its claws, long, sharp, and slick, scraped along the floor with a sickening noise. The giant rat was real, and it was coming straight for me. I swung the rod in front of me, not knowing what else to do. But the rat was faster than I could react. It lunged at me with an unnerving speed, its jaws snapping shut just inches from my face. I screamed and backed away, crashing into the counter. The rod slipped from my hands as I tried to scramble away from the creature. Its eyes, glowing like twin infernos, never left me. The scraping noise, that horrible, sickening sound, was deafening now, a chorus of claws scraping on metal, on wood, on everything around me. I had to get out. But the doors were still shaking, still rattling with every violent slam against them. Then I heard it, a sound that chilled me to my core. The sound of more scratching, more clicking, more movement. And this time, it was coming from every direction. There was no escape. The floor beneath me creaked as though the very foundation of the building was giving way. I could feel the vibrations from the claws scratching, dragging across the walls, creeping through the thin metal, and reverberating through the air like an unbearable, tortured song. I had to get out. There was no thinking, no hesitation, only survival. My legs shook beneath me, the fear setting in deep like a cold vice. The air felt thick, stifling. I tried to steady my breath, but the realization hit me. I wasn't just up against one monster anymore. The room was alive with movement. More of them, those horrible, glowing eyes, were everywhere. I could hear their breath, shallow and quick, as they crowded closer. They were surrounding me, making their presence felt in the stifling dark. I could hear them scratching at the walls, the floors, even the air itself. Their collective movement was a nightmare made real, and it was closing in. I stumbled toward the back door again. The door I had found earlier had been locked, impossibly so, but I didn't care anymore. I didn't have time to worry about its mechanism. My hands were shaking, and I could barely hold onto the handle as I twisted it with all my remaining strength. Nothing. The door wouldn't budge. The scraping grew louder, the sounds of those filthy claws, sliding and tearing against everything in their path. One by one, they were entering, and soon they'd be here, close enough to touch, their rancid, wet bodies pressing against the walls. I knew what they wanted. I knew what they were after. I heard something large scuttling above me. Then the sound of gnawing, scraping at something I couldn't see, coming from the ceiling. My heart raced. How were they getting in? I hadn't seen any ventilation shafts. Had they been here all along, hiding, watching? Another scrape, a hard, hollow sound, came from the corner of the room. My eyes darted toward it, and I saw it. The first giant rat. The one that had nearly killed me. Its monstrous head emerged from the darkness, its eyes burning like hot coals. It tilted its head, as if studying me. Its nose twitched, and the air was thick with the scent of decay. I couldn't move. I couldn't speak. I couldn't breathe. All I could do was stare into the eyes of this thing, this nightmare that had once been a rat. Then, from the darkness behind it, I saw others, more shadows, more figures. Their eyes gleamed at me in the blackness. They were everywhere. They were all around me. They had come for me. I reached for the metal rod again, but the creature was faster. It lunged at me, its jaws snapping as it closed the distance in an instant. I didn't have time to react. The force of its impact knocked me to the floor. I could feel its breath, hot, foul, against my face, its sharp claws scraping across my skin. I screamed. The creature's mouth opened wide, and I could see its teeth, yellow, jagged, and sharp, ready to tear into my flesh. I kicked out in desperation, my foot connecting with its side. The rat hissed in pain and recoiled, but it didn't back off. The others were coming closer, too. I couldn't fight them off. I couldn't win. I had no way to stop the madness, no way to escape. Panic surged through me, consuming all rational thought. I turned and bolted for the door again. It was the only chance I had. I didn't care about the lock anymore. I just needed to get out, to breathe fresh air, to escape whatever nightmare had come alive in these tunnels. The lock clicked as I threw myself against the door, desperation fueling my every movement. The door opened. But as I stepped outside, the horror didn't end. The desert night was alive with the same dark shapes, the same glowing eyes. They were all around me, lurking in the shadows. 100, maybe more. And they weren't just rats. I could see figures standing in the distance, tall, hunched creatures with humanoid shapes, their faces hidden in the darkness. But their eyes, those eyes, burned like fire, glowing brighter and brighter as I stood frozen in place. I realized then, I wasn't just facing rats anymore. These things were intelligent. They were waiting for me to make a mistake, to give them a reason to strike. My heart pounded in my chest as I stepped backward, the sound of dry sand crunching beneath my feet. The door slammed shut behind me with a hollow thud. I was outside, but I wasn't free. The night seemed to close in on me, the air thick with the smell of death. The rats were now joined by their masters, beasts of nightmare. Creatures beyond comprehension, creatures that shouldn't exist. They moved toward me, slowly, methodically, as if they knew I had nowhere to go. The sound of their movements, shuffling feet, soft clicking claws, breathy growls, echoed in the still night, and I realized with a jolt that I was truly alone in this hell. There was no escape. No help. And the nightmare was closing in. I turned and ran, my legs aching, my breath sharp in my throat. I could hear them following. I could hear them getting closer, and then the sound of something heavy falling behind me, a crash, a grinding noise, a scream. Not from me. The shadows around me moved again, closing in on their prey. I had no idea how long I ran, but I felt like I was being swallowed by the desert itself. The heat from the sunless sky beat down on me, and I could barely see, but I knew I couldn't stop. Not now. Not ever again. I heard one last scrape, the last sound I would ever hear. And then, there was nothing. I woke to silence. The kind of silence that presses down on you, fills every crevice, every corner of your thoughts, making you wonder if you're even alive anymore. The faint taste of dust and blood coated my tongue, and for a moment, I couldn't remember where I was. My eyes flickered open, and the reality crashed down upon me like a cold wave. I was still in the desert, but now it felt like a different place altogether. The sun had set, what felt like hours ago, but the darkness felt wrong. Too thick, too deep. The stars were barely visible through the thick, unnatural cloud cover that blanketed the sky. It was as though something was smothering the light, swallowing it whole. I sat up, my body stiff, aching, and bruised. The ground beneath me was hot, almost unbearable. It felt like I had been lying there for far too long. I looked around, trying to make sense of my surroundings. Nothing looked familiar. There were no signs of life, no markers that could indicate a path or direction. Only the endless desert, stretching in every direction, a vast ocean of sand and emptiness. I scrambled to my feet, my head spinning with dizziness. The world was disorienting, like I was floating just outside of it, no longer fully part of it. There was no sound, no wind, no animals, no life of any kind. Just an oppressive silence that felt like it was about to crush me. The panic started to crawl up my throat again. I tried to take a deep breath, but the air felt wrong, thick with the scent of something rotten and foul. I looked around desperately, hoping for some sign, some escape. But all I could see were the shifting shadows in the distance. The shadows that had haunted me since I first arrived here. The creatures. The rats. They were still out there, watching me. I was about to start running again when a sound broke through the silence, a soft rustle, a faint whisper on the wind. My body froze. My breath caught in my throat. I wasn't alone. I turned quickly, but there was nothing there. Nothing except the endless stretch of desert and the faint traces of footprints in the sand, footprints that didn't belong to me. They were fresh, too fresh. Someone, or something, had been here recently. And they were still close. I couldn't hear anything else, but my senses were on high alert, every fiber of my being screaming at me to move. To run. To escape. But where? How? There was no way out. My eyes flicked to the distant hills. Maybe there was something up there, something I could use to my advantage. The rocks. The crevices. I had to find a place to hide, to get away from whatever was following me. As I started to move toward the hills, I could feel it. The sensation of being hunted. Of something closing in from behind. My every step seemed to echo, the sound magnified in the thick silence. The desert stretched out before me, and yet it felt like the walls were closing in. The shadows, the creatures, they were everywhere. They were watching, waiting. And then I heard it, the scrape again. A soft scratching noise in the sand. It was faint, but it was there. Too close for comfort. I spun around, my heart racing. The desert was empty. No movement. No sound. But the scraping, the faintest hint of claws against sand, it was there. It was real. I had to keep moving. I forced myself to keep walking, pushing through the fear that clutched at my chest, threatening to suffocate me. My feet felt heavy, each step a labor as I trudged through the sand. The night felt endless. The air was thick, and the smell of rot was stronger now, almost unbearable. I reached the base of the hills and began to climb. The rocks beneath my hands were rough, jagged, and sharp, but they felt like a lifeline. The higher I went, the better the view. Maybe I could spot something. A path. A way out. But when I reached the top, the landscape was more terrifying than I could have imagined. The hills didn't lead to freedom. They led to the heart of the nightmare. What I saw before me could only be described as a vast expanse of destruction. The earth was scarred, as if something had torn through it, leaving deep gouges and cracks in the ground. The land was littered with the remnants of old buildings, rusted metal, and broken vehicles. It was a graveyard, not of the living, but of something far worse. And there, in the center of it all, was a massive, twisted structure. A monument of bone and metal, as though the earth itself had been reshaped into something grotesque. Something unnatural. It was hard to tell where the bones began and the metal ended, but they were intertwined, fused together in a grotesque sculpture of decay. And there, in the distance, were the eyes again. The same eyes I had seen before, glowing in the dark, watching from every corner, every shadow. The rats. The creatures. They were not just here. They were everywhere. And they were waiting for me. The moment I realized this, the terror surged back. I turned to run, but the sand beneath me seemed to shift, as if it were alive. The ground trembled, and I could feel something huge moving beneath the surface, pushing its way up toward me. I didn't have time to think. I only had time to run. The darkness swallowed me whole as I descended from the hills, stumbling in the sand, heart pounding, mind racing with fear. The scrape of claws was louder now. The beasts were closing in, and I could hear the unmistakable sound of their breaths, raspy, labored, and too close. The desert had become a cage, and I was the prey. And I wasn't sure if I could escape. The world around me felt like it was falling apart, like the very earth was crumbling beneath my feet, and there was no escape from the horrors that awaited. There was only one thing I knew for sure. I had to survive. But survival, in this place, was becoming more and more impossible by the second. I ran, my legs burning with every step. My breath was shallow, ragged, like I couldn't fill my lungs enough. The air was thick with dust and fear. It felt like I was suffocating, but I couldn't stop. I couldn't think. There was only one instinct driving me forward: survival. The creatures were close. I could feel them now, just behind me, skittering through the sand, their claws scraping the earth with an unnerving rhythm. I glanced over my shoulder, but the darkness was too thick. I couldn't see them, but I could hear them, those terrifying, raspy breaths. The low, guttural growls that made my skin crawl. The sand shifted again, this time more violently. The earth beneath my feet trembled, as though something massive was pushing its way through, following my every movement. I stumbled, falling to my knees, the world spinning as I struggled to get back up. I had to keep moving. I didn't dare look up. I didn't dare stop running. If I stopped, even for a second, I knew I wouldn't survive. The ground beneath me cracked, a deep rumble splitting the silence. I glanced around frantically, searching for any sign of safety, but there was nothing. Only the same endless stretch of desert, now twisted and warped by the terror that surrounded me. That's why I saw it. The structure. The thing I had glimpsed earlier from the top of the hills. The twisted monument of bone and metal. It was closer now, looming over me like some dark, monstrous deity. It stood tall, rising from the center of the desert like a forgotten nightmare, its jagged edges gleaming in the dim light. The bones were not just scattered, no, they were part of the structure itself, fused into the walls like the very foundation of this hellish creation. And the eyes. They were watching me. Dozens, no, hundreds of them, glowing in the darkness. I could feel them on me, tracking my every move. They weren't just eyes, they were something worse. Something alive. Something sentient. I turned away from the structure, my body screaming in pain as I forced myself to keep running. I had no plan. No strategy. There was nothing left except the desperate, primal need to escape. But there was no escape. The desert had become a maze, a labyrinth of shifting sand and looming shadows. No matter where I ran, the creatures were always there, just out of sight, but always closing in. I could feel my strength fading. My muscles were giving out, my body aching from the exhaustion. I had been running for hours, days, maybe. The sun had long disappeared, and the only light now came from the glowing eyes of the creatures that hunted me. I collapsed. My chest heaved as I gasped for air, my face pressed into the sand. My hands shook as I tried to push myself up, but it was no use. My body refused to obey. I was done. And then I heard it. The sound of footsteps. Slow, deliberate, coming closer. I couldn't move. I couldn't speak. I just lay there, waiting for whatever was going to happen next. The silence stretched on, broken only by the sound of my own labored breathing. And then, from the darkness, a figure appeared. It wasn't one of the creatures. It wasn't one of the rats. It was a man. Or at least, it looked like one. He was tall, his features hidden beneath a tattered cloak that seemed to blend with the shadows around him. His eyes glowed faintly, like the creatures, but they weren't as predatory. There was something otherworldly about him. Something ancient. Something that didn't belong here. He stood before me, silent, unmoving, as though he were waiting for something. I couldn't speak, couldn't move, couldn't even look away from those eyes that pierced through me. His gaze seemed to reach inside me, pulling at the very core of my being. "Do you wish to survive?" he asked, his voice a low whisper that sent a chill through my body. I nodded, desperate, frantic. I had to survive. I had to get out of here. He stepped closer, his presence overwhelming, filling the air with an oppressive weight. "The price of survival," he continued, "is far greater than you know." I couldn't think. I could barely breathe. But I needed to escape. I needed to get out of this nightmare. He reached out a hand, and for a moment, I thought he was going to offer me help. But then I saw it, the shadow behind him. It was moving. It was growing. I turned, and that's when I saw them. The rats. The creatures. Hundreds of them, their glowing eyes reflecting the pale light of the moon. Their bodies were massive, grotesque, their claws dragging across the ground as they moved toward us. They were no longer the distant threat I had feared. They were here. And they were hungry. The figure in front of me didn't move. He didn't flinch as the creatures closed in, their claws clicking against the rocks. It was as if you were waiting for something, waiting for me to make a choice. I didn't have a choice. Not anymore. I pushed myself to my feet, my body trembling with fear, my mind racing for an escape. But there was nowhere to run, no place to hide. The creatures were here. They were everywhere. And then the figure spoke again, his voice cold and distant. You have no escape. No place left to run. I turned to face him, my heart pounding in my chest, my mind a whirlwind of terror. And then the ground split open. A massive crack appeared beneath my feet, and I felt myself being pulled toward it, the darkness beneath me opening up like the mouth of some terrible beast. I tried to scream, to fight back, but the creatures were too close now. Their jaws were snapping, their claws reaching out to drag me down into the depths. The last thing I saw before I was consumed by the abyss was the figure, standing in the desert, watching as I disappeared into the darkness. And in that moment, I understood. There was no escape. Not for me. Not for anyone. Thank you for making our stories part of your relaxation time. We hope they brought you a sense of peace and transported you to a world of fantasy and mystery. If you enjoyed the stories, feel free to leave us a review. Your feedback inspires us and helps us make the content even better. Now, unwind to the calming sounds of rain and thunderstorms, which will continue to set a tranquil mood. Let these sounds carry you gently into the realm of dreams. Don't forget to like our page if you haven't yet. Wishing you a restful night's sleep. Relax, rest well, and good night.